Smits already talked, is of enormous importance. Enormous importance not only for Europe, and that is exactly what we talk about today. We also wonder to what extent the Green Deal also has implications, more particularly for trade and investment in the relationship with China. The question, of course, is, does it provide opportunities, challenges? Is it a hurdle, or is it in fact something that provides a big future? And this is, according to us, one of the first seminars, webinars, where this relationship between, on the one hand, the Green Deal, on the other hand, relationships in trade with China will be explored. You see me sitting here in the boardroom of the law faculty at Maastricht University. But we are very happy that thanks to the technical support, we will have participants from all over the world and even speakers, contributors from Australia. For us here, it is very early in the morning. I know for you in China, it is in the afternoon. For our colleague in Australia, even still later. This event takes place in Maastricht, but it is based on a long-standing collaboration about which the Dean already talked with Professor Nicolas de Sadeleer from the University of Saint-Louis in Brussels. And we're extremely happy that Professor de Sadeleer is willing to take up this important topic. Many of you who know environmental law and environmental policy will know this famous book. Some of us really call it the Bible as far as environmental principles is concerned. And so the author of this Bible on environmental principles is Professor Nicolas de Sadeleer, present here with us. I was told that even the book has been translated in Chinese. Whether that took place with his knowledge and consent is a little detail that we're not going to talk about. But just to mention, Professor de Sadeleer is well known also in China. We will try to make this work also with technical support. I am sitting here with Professor Sadeleer, but also with nice people who are helping and supporting us to make everything go smooth. There will be a first session that I will introduce later on the level of ambition in the Green Deal and also on the contents of the Green Deal. And I will have the pleasure of sharing that with 4 speakers. What you can do, obviously, is to participate actively through posing questions. How will that take place? There is a possibility for you to pose questions in the chat. So please write your questions in the chat, preferably in English. If really you have a problem, you can write them in Chinese, because we have someone here who masters Mandarin Chinese as well. And then, as you might have seen, we have first a session with 4 presentations, but then we also have a panel with question and answers that will be moderated by Nicolas de Sadeleer. And then the questions will be taken up that you have posted in the chat. That is the only way that we can manage it with 300 participants. Now, I will now hand the floor to Professor Nicolas de Sadeleer for his introductory words. He will especially explain that this is the first seminar taking place in a project that we are leading together, Nicolas and I, concerning this important topic of collaboration between China and the EU in the Green Deal, the consequences for trade and investment. And this is financed by the EU. So Professor de Sadeleer will tell a little bit about the context and the background of this entire project and the role of the seminar within this. So now I hand the floor to Professor Nicolas de Sadeleer.
Yes, good morning or good evening to everybody. It's a pleasure to introduce this session with my colleague Michael Faure. It's also a pleasure to be back in Maastricht. You are perhaps aware that restrictions have been placed in Europe on the movement of persons for a long period. This project supported by the Agency for Education of the European Union. The project was carved out by Ivana Damjanovic from the University of Canberra and myself, and has been proposed by the University of Maastricht a year ago. And this conference is the first conference that we shall organize. Hopefully we will be able to organize in a near future conferences in Asia. The project unfolds around the trade and investment relationship between China and the European Union. Treaty on investment has been signed by the two parties. That treaty is not yet into force. And nowadays, international economic law cannot be understood without paying consideration to sustainable development and environmental as well as health concerns. And given that the EU is embarking upon a significant policy and legal reform, ranging from the energy transition to ecosystemic approach, it occurs to us that there was a need, as regarding the first event we do organize, to place emphasis on the Green Deal reform. And so this first seminar shall shed light on the content of this reform, and the slides have been translated into Chinese, so Chinese scholars and students are very welcome to beg their questions in Chinese. They will be translated. I give the floor to the first speaker.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, for the kind introductory words. We now, exactly on time, start with our first session. The first session is called The Level of Ambition of the Green Deal. Now, those of you who read newspapers already know that the Green Deal is extremely ambitious. The EU wants to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. That is a very ambitious idea. And of course, one of the first things that we want to do in this first session with 4 contributions is to examine how to reach this climate neutrality. What is the contents? We have 4 contributions, first by Marian Peters on the EU climate objectives. Then Nicolas de Sadeleer and Ivana Damjanovic will talk about the environmental principles underpinning the deal. And then we go to the important topic to be addressed by an economist on the state aid. It is a typical European phenomenon, but the state aid can also provide lots of opportunities and possibilities for investment. It can stimulate investment as well. And finally, we will have a Chinese star within this first session, well-known Professor Wang Canfa. I think all of the Chinese and many other participants may know him, who will talk about what are the implications for China in order to align with all the European targets. The first speaker is Professor Marian Peters, a professor of climate law from Maastricht University. Also, her work has been translated into Chinese. Unfortunately, she was not able to be here in person, but we have a video of her performance that will start immediately, and also with some help that we had here, and we gratefully acknowledge. Also, some of the sheets were translated in Chinese. So I will ask the technical support to start the presentation of Marian Peters now.
Dear colleagues of the European Environmental Law Forum, welcome to my presentation. The title of my talk is Managing the Uncertain Future, the Codified Trajectory to a Climate-Neutral European Union. And in my talk, I'm obviously going to delve into the European climate law, a new regulation adopted in June this year, 2021. And before I'm going to delve into this new regulation, I would like to set the scene by sketching 2 features of EU climate law. The first one is not a positive one. It is that EU climate law can be characterized as largely uncharted legal territory. With that, I try to say that it has challenge to get a good understanding of EU climate law. It is a complex package of provisions, and moreover, it's subjected to many changes. More importantly, this is also a challenge for practitioners who have to put the law from the books in practice. The second feature is a positive one. It is that the EU has succeeded in setting legally binding targets, an intensified target for 2030 and the codification of climate neutrality for 2050. With that, we can see that the EU has used law to impose on itself obligations and on the member states. It's a self-imposition of binding obligations. And here it is, the European Climate Law, a regulation establishing the framework for achieving climate neutrality. It's a very important step, this codification. But now the question emerges, how then to modify our society? How to change the energy system quickly enough? How to change economic sectors, how to change consumer behavior. So now we have to try to modify. The codification is there, the modification now has to happen. And that is truly a challenge. Before I delve into some means on how to implement the objective and the target, first a short look at the objective. Here it is, in Article 2. And I do not have time to unravel all the interesting elements of this definition, but I would like to highlight one dimension, and that is that this target is a collective target. So it applies to the 27 member states as a whole, to the whole territory of the 27 member states together. The European Parliament has tried in the legislative process to regulate national climate neutrality, so that a member state would have to become climate neutral on its own territory. This is not put into the final regulation. So now we see we do have this obligation of collective climate neutrality. Of course, if a member state still wants to go for national climate neutrality, it needs to be considered how that then sits given EU law and more particularly specific EU climate law. I now move to the targets. We don't have yet a target for 2040, but we do have an intense. It's a net target of 55% to be achieved in 2030. It's a balancing of emissions and removals. And during the legislative process, more priority has been given to the need to reduce emissions, to emission reduction. This is done by putting a limit to the contribution of sinks to the net target for 2030. In that way, the target has become more ambitious compared to the Commission proposal. However, at the same time, 2030 is coming very soon. So the more ambitious target will lead to, well, a higher challenge to achieve it as well. There is less flexibility to comply with the target because there's less possibility to balance. The emphasis goes to emission reductions and a limited role for sinks. There are other interesting elements in the final regulation that are new compared to the Commission proposal. I would like to highlight two of them. The first one relates to the power for the Commission. The Commission in its proposal said, well, give to us the competence to adopt a delegated act to set the trajectory for the needed emission reductions over time towards climate neutrality. But in the final regulation, the Commission is only tasked to develop a report. Well, a report has no legal status. So here we truly see less formal power for the Commission. This report is about to set the indicative union greenhouse gas budget. I still, however, think that this report can still play quite an influential role, and I will come back to that later in my talk. The second feature is the establishment of a European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change, a new provision inserted during the legislative process. It will be very interesting to examine what the role then will be of the advices of this new board. How influential will it be during the process? That's yet uncertain, but we now see this opportunity of scientific advice that has, of course, to be taken on board. I now move to two means from the regulation that aim to contribute to achieving the target and the objective. The first one is a procedural provision, an obligation for the Commission to take climate change into account when developing any other proposal. The Commission shall assess the consistency of any draft measure or legislative proposal with the climate neutrality objective and with the targets for 2030 and later 2040. So impact assessments have to be developed and published. And in case that the Commission cannot align the proposal with the objective, it has to state the reasons. This is, of course, only a procedural provision, but in my view, potentially a very strong one. It makes clear that with all the other policies of the European Union, climate change needs to be considered, and that the content of the proposal has to be consistent with achieving these important aims. Let's see how this provision will work. Its success will, of course, depend first and foremost how the Commission will implement it. The next mean is the governance approach, for which the Commission has also a very important role to play. The Commission has the task to carry out assessments, collective assessments, individual assessments of, to say it short, the progress made in view of the objective and the target. And related to these assessments are Commission recommendations. The Commission has the power to issue a recommendation to an individual shortfalling member state. A recommendation has no legal binding force. It's not legally binding according to the treaty. So it's a soft steering mechanism. It's a governance mechanism. But at the same time, we also see a shall obligation. That's for the member state. The member state shall communicate to the Commission how it intends to take due account of the recommendation in a spirit of solidarity between the member states. So there is this obligation to have a dialogue. And I made in an earlier talk, which is on YouTube, the position that I would not be surprised that in future national climate litigation, the content of Commission recommendations is going to play a role in national adjudication as a kind of a source with information that can be considered by the judges when, for instance, having to consider an order to be imposed on the national government to step up climate action. It's unpredictable how this will develop, this national climate litigation. I will be surprised that in an indirect way, Commission recommendations can play a role. And then very shortly, I would like to refer you to a very recent case that I have yet to study in more detail, where the Court of Justice has said that the spirit of solidarity is a justiciable principle of EU law. And the spirit of solidarity is actually also in the European climate law. It is there. So this is also a very first sign that there are more possibilities to enforce duties of provisions of the European climate law. Very uncertain what will happen, but I do see a slight sign here. And of course, it's remarkable because it's a vague notion, the spirit of solidarity. And if this would become a justiciable one, well, that also, of course, raises some fundamental questions on the role of the court. But it is a sign to be studied and to be discussed. Dear colleagues, I arrive at my conclusions. The codification of the European climate law is a very important step. So the codification of the climate neutrality objective and the target for 2030. very important steps. However, the legal relevance of the regulation as such raises some questions. Several provisions are not clear. We have to figure out what it means. And litigation is a mean through which the legal provisions can be further become clarified. And I think that's my position, that even while the regulation has many provisions that as such do not have direct legal force, like the greenhouse gas budget report by the Commission, the assessment of measures in light of climate targets, the advice from the board, the Commission recommendations, perhaps they will still play quite some influential indirect role in litigation cases. That could be the case if, well, we have the pressing the urgent need to step up action to modify society to reach the objectives, and in that way I would not be surprised if these documents are going to play a role in litigation. I put that forward as a position. If that would happen though, then the power from EU level would become more strong. So then also some institutional and even political questions will be raised and have to be further considered. I end my talk with the unanswered question. How are we going to achieve the 2030 and 2050 targets? Will the EU legislative framework be amended quickly enough? Will implementation be on time? Again, it's hard to see how we can modify so quickly society in order to achieve the intensified 2030 target. We have to try, but it's a major change. Will national litigation fill any gaps? How will the enforceability look like? What are actually also the solutions that can be implemented quickly enough in only a few years actually? And in that respect, I would like to end with a statement, and that's about voluntary action. It's clear now that we have the codification of the objective and the target. It's also clear that still EU climate law has to change, an amendment of the EU ETS directive, effort sharing regulation, etc. But should society wait for these changes? Shouldn't important actors already try to take action now? What about, for instance, and I mean also voluntary action, what about our own organizations, our universities? Let's have a look at our own organizations as an example. Shouldn't we also step up action as far as we are able to do so? If we, for instance, look at travel policies, shouldn't we take this momentum of COVID to say, well, we have changed our behavior due to COVID, and we should freeze traveling because of the need to reduce emissions. I'm afraid to say that I see in my own university, Maastricht University, that it's not easy to gain wide support for tremendous change of our emission behavior, of reducing our carbon footprint that we do by means of traveling. And in that sense, dear colleagues, although I would have appreciated to see you in person, I'm actually not very depressed that we had to have this conference online. It's perhaps our way then of contributing already to the achievement of the aims now codified in EU climate law. With that, I end my presentation. I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any comment. Thank you very much.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think that we can be very grateful to Marianne Peters, Professor of Climate Law, for this interesting talk. Now, you saw that something miraculous was happening when Professor Peters was talking. At some moment, there were translations of the most important points that she mentioned in Chinese, and it mentioned that it came from Professor Nicolas de Sadeleer. Well, I have to tell you, Professor de Sadeleer has many abilities and many capacities, but his knowledge in the Chinese language was not such that he was translating himself. It was, in fact, Lan Ying, and I thank her very much, who made all of those translations available. I think that this first introduction was very useful, very important, that it taught us important lessons about the possibilities for the Commission also to assess the progress that is made in achieving climate neutrality. Marianne also talked about the importance of the recommendations that would be made in the framework of climate litigation. Now, some of you might know that, especially in the Netherlands, there have been in the recent years important decisions, even up to the Supreme Court in the Netherlands, where the state in the so-called Urgenda case was forced to take more climate action. So it is in that framework that it has to be seen. Now, Marianne, unfortunately, is not present here, but if you might have questions for that, no worries. Professor Nicolas de Sadeleer is a man who knows all topics, and I'm sure that in that respect, he might be able also to answer questions that would relate to what has been said before. At this moment, we can turn to the second presentation, that is by Professor Nicolas de Sadeleer, that will be given together with Ivana Damjanovic, who also initiated, as he already mentioned, the entire project from the University of Canberra in Australia, and it will deal with the environmental principles underpinning the Green Deal and also the geopolitical impact. Ivana and Nicola, you have the floor.
Yes. Ivana, can you start?
Yes, so good evening, everyone, or good morning in Europe, good afternoon in China. And I'm very pleased to be with you today in this seminar. And although from far away, I wish I could actually join you in person. But anyway, we are where we are. So when we talk about today's topic, it's always good to go back to the very basics, why we are here and why European Green Deal. So I like practical examples, and one good example to think about climate change is the increase of the temperature. So imagine if our body temperature which is normally 37 degrees Celsius, if it increased 1.1 degrees Celsius, we would have a fever. So we would need to take some medication, an aspirin or a Panadol or something to stop the increase of temperature and to actually get that temperature down. So that is exactly what is happening with our planet. And European Green Deal is, in a way, European response, European aspirin to that fever. So you can see here, Nicolas has assembled some of the pictures of the recent floodings in Europe. I could provide a lot of pictures from the continent on which I live. So basically, climate change is a global problem, and the EU is trying to be a global leader in terms of the change in the ways that the economies work and in the ways that societies also work. Could I have the next slide, please? Yes, so what is the European Green Deal? Some things have already been said in terms of the ambitious climate goals that Europe has set for itself and its member states. So the best way to think about the European Green Deal is as a plan to transform economy and society to meet those climate ambitions. So it is a set of different proposals, set of different policies, coherent policies that are meant to work coherently towards meeting those objectives. So you can see from this slide that those policies go from agriculture, so from farm to fork, there will be talk about this later, from environmental aspects, energy, financing, transport, research as well, so, and trade. So my area work is more in the investment and trade, but European Green Deal also is oriented towards trade policies of the European Union. So, and we'll look at a bit later in this presentation, I will talk a bit more about the geopolitical impacts of those policies. Could I have the next slide, please? So I think the Professor Peters in previous speech talked about climate neutrality challenge. So, but the main idea is that Europe wants to lead the way towards the deep transformation of economy and society to achieve climate neutrality. So not only to reduce to reduce the temperature or in terms of global warming, but also to transform the economy and society. So if you think about it, not only to heal in a way that we actually work better for the future, so that we don't experience those impacts later. So what are some of the main principles? What is the narrative that the EU is developing around the Green Deal? So one main axis of work is economic growth, which has to be decoupled from resource use. So if we think about our economy and society, we ultimately depend on natural resources. And basically the idea of economic growth decoupled from resource use is to enable economy to keep growing, but at the same time without using more resources which have impact on in our environment. So and Nicholas will talk about this further in the presentation. Another important principle is fair and inclusive transition. So basically, as Professor Peters mentioned before, she talked about the collective target. So fair and inclusive transition is also related to that collective target. So some states will contribute more, some than the others, depending on their possibilities. But fair and inclusive transition also means helping those member states that are laggard in terms of climate change to reach the objectives, but also helping on a more microeconomic level. So helping vulnerable households, helping businesses to meet those climate objectives, providing financial assistance in that respect. Then protecting, preserving, and enhancing the natural heritage. So here we're talking about protecting ecosystems, because good ecosystems help carbon capture. So that's also part of the picture. On the one hand, changing the economy, but also on the other hand, protecting ecosystems that will capture carbon. And of course, citizens are part of this. So eventually, climate change is bad for health, for well-being. So the goal of European Green Deal is also to protect the health and citizens from different environmental risks. I give over to Nicholas now.
Yes, as Mrs. Damjanovic underscored, there is an economic dimension underpinning the whole Green Deal. In the visions of the European Commission, the executive of the EU, it is possible to decouple economic growth from the emissions of greenhouse gases. So on the one hand, for the period between 2018, the EU reduced the greenhouse gas emissions by 23%, whereas the economy grew by 61%. However, with current policies, the emissions will be cut only by 60% by 2050. So it means that as business goes, the climate neutrality objective won't be reached by 2050. And the main goal underpinning the Green Deal is to achieve a 55% reductions of greenhouse gas by 2030, that's nearly tomorrow morning, and to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. This is provided for under climate law regulation 2020-1119. So it means that the carbon market will be extended from installations to maritime transport, and that will lead also to cancelling free allocation of allowances for aviations. We shall come back to this issue later on in the course of the second session. So on the one hand, the carbon market provided for under EU law since 2015 shall be expanded, and this is a fairly centralized approach. On the other hand, the member states are obligated under the effort sharing regulations to diminish, to provide measures, tax measures, economic measures, regulatory measures, in order to diminish the greenhouse gas emissions from transport, building, agriculture, smaller industrial installations, besides the EU carbon market trading. Besides, the European companies do face this carbon leakage. They have to pay more in order to purchase the allowances covering their greenhouse gas emissions. On the other hand, a number of countries do not implement similar schemes. And the EU Commission proposes to adopt a carbon border adjustment mechanism for specific economic sectors that do emit a significant amount of greenhouse gases, with a view to reducing the risk of carbon leakage. That will be the speech of the second session, where we shall contemplate the different consequences, the different effects of that carbon border adjustment mechanism. So what matters from an EU point of view is to incentivize states as well as companies to move into a renewable energy production. According to the European Commission, a number of directives have to be reviewed in order to flesh out the general objective of achieving climate change by 2050. In particular, the Renewable Energy Directive that provides so far that 32% of the EU's energy consumption must come from renewable energy sources by 2030, aimed to achieve a target of a minimum of 40% of renewable energy sources. So it will be a jump from 32% to 40% by 2030. As a result, significant efforts will have to be carried out by the 27 member states in order to enhance this energy transition shift. And so Europe is likely to lead the way in abandoning fossil fuels to embark upon an energy revolution. That means that, on the other hand, Europe has to provide for better resource efficient buildings, buildings that do not emit CO2, whereas today 40% of the energy consumed on the continent are from private and public buildings. Transport that do emit a quarter of the EU greenhouse gas must also be subject to significant changes. So the European Commission is proposing to tighten CO2 emission standards for cars and vans. And here are some of the numbers. By 2030, 30 million cars should not emit any CO2. 80,000 lorries should not emit any CO2. By 2050, so the time of achieving the climate neutrality, nearly all cars, vans, bus, as well as heavy vehicles will be zero emissions. By the same token, new ocean-going vessels will be zero emission, as well as new aircraft by 2035. I shall comment in the second session the reform that will take place in the areas of products and waste, aiming at achieving circular economy. Our colleague, Niels Philipsen, shall comment later on in the course of this session the manner in which the European Commission is intent upon modifying state aid law in order to incentivize the companies investing in Europe to provide it for new services and new products that are less energy incentives. What matters is the policy dimensions underpinning the Green Deal. The European Commission has been adopting so far a number of strategies that are not binding. And in particular, the focus has been placed upon ecosystem conservation. So the idea is to ward off the risk stemming from the rising temperature, as we have seen in the first slide, in improving biodiversity, in improving forest resilience, in shifting from a very intensive farming production to a less intensive production, in improving the quality of the water and the air. Besides that, the European Commission is enacting new strategies regarding industrial development, chemicals, sustainable and smart mobility, as well as sustainable finance. As Mrs. Damjanovic underscored, Green Deal is also about allowing a fair and equitable energy transitions. That means that greening the agricultural policy in making food system fair, healthy, and more environmental friendly. And our colleague, Ellen Voss, shall comment upon the visions exposed by the European Commission. To make Europe fairer regarding energy production and consumptions means also that specific EU funds must intervene in order to afford the financial support to micro businesses, to vulnerable households, to people in poverty that are unable to pay their energy bills. And that's going to lead to a renovation wave that's going to be supported by the Social Climate Fund. So we are talking about 1 trillion euros to be spent in the 10 coming years. 25% of all EU financial program shall aim at achieving these energy transitions. The European Investment Bank will become Europe's first climate bank and perhaps the biggest climate bank on the planet. I give you the floor. Yes, the micro.
Sorry, I'll just briefly touch upon the impacts of this European Green Deal in terms of geopolitics. So what does this mean for Europe? And if you read different Commission's documents, there are different labels that were given to the current Commission of Ursula von der Leyen, naming it as a geopolitical Commission. And on one hand, that means more coherence between internal and external policies, which is the principle already enshrined in the Treaty on the European Union, so in the founding treaties. So basically, what that means, what the EU does internally wants to also transform or transit externally. And also more coherence between different external policies, so between diplomacy, so green diplomacy, trade policy, development policy, multilaterally, bilaterally, so different levels of cooperation, as well as more coherence between the policies of the European Union as well as the member states. And the other important aspect that the current Commission is putting forward is strategic autonomy. So on the one hand, that means building capacities so that Europe has stronger capacities, in particular in the sphere of security and defense, which is not our focus here, but more in relation to European Green Deal, less reliance on others economically. That also means less reliance on others in terms of resources, so being more independent. So how do these, in a way, realpolitik concepts relate to the Green Deal? These concepts are not really something that we usually associate with the European Union and its mission. So if we look at the Green Deal, really geopolitics in this context means green norms. So, and we see that export of green norms that the EU does in different ways. So trade policy, new trade policy, which was released earlier this year, called Open, Sustainable, Assertive. So sustainable development being a very important aspect of that policy. And in the second part, we will talk about that in the context of the investment agreement with China. Carbon border adjustment mechanism, so we'll also talk about that, but very important aspect of the external aspect of the Green Deal. And there are other measures that the EU is proposing, so mandatory due diligence to ensure sustainability of products, so that the products are deforestation free, so in order to protect forests globally. Moving away from fossil fuels, so the energy transition, and other initiatives in terms of corporate governance, so making corporations, private entities more sustainable, public climate finance, as Nicholas has mentioned as well before, but also the European food as global standard for sustainability. So far, European food has been put forward as a global standard for quality in terms of European geographical indications and so on. But of course, these new standards for sustainability will certainly have impact for imported food, and EU also wants to develop a sustainable food labeling framework. So something that will be discussed later by speakers. Next slide, please. So can the EU be a global leader? That is really the question. So far, the EU's power traditionally has been a normative and transformative. So exporting norms to others, so the so-called Brussels effect. And of course, the EU is pretty much aware that this ecological transition will reshape geopolitics, and that is where the EU wants to take the lead. So the EU wants to be the leader of this transition in different ways, while also still using that power of the internal market to set standards across the global value chain. So using its economic weight to shape international standards and influence third countries. Next one, please. So here we have Nicholas eating cake, but what I'm trying to say here is whether the EU is trying to have a cake and eat it too. So basically a very interesting English saying, but in a way, the strategic autonomy that the EU wants to achieve on the one hand means less dependence on external factors, but on the other hand, if the EU is more autonomous, that also means less external leverage. So really the challenge here for the EU is to combine this independence of strategic autonomy with interdependence through which the EU can then influence third countries. So it's really that attempt that will be challenging. Nicholas?
According to the latest scientific analysis, it occurs that if we continue to emit this amount of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we might face quickly ecological collapse. So of importance is that some organizations like the EU take the lead and try to influence third nations, such as China, to move into an energy transition. And so the question is whether we can shift from a risk of ecological collapse to a new dawn. And so what we shall discuss in the course of these two sessions is whether the Green Deal can bring us a new dawn. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Nicolas and Ivana. It is always a tremendous pleasure to listen to the insightful lectures of Nicolas de Sadeleer. And this time it was even more so when it was also enlightened with the wonderful support by Ivana. I have learned a lot from the enormously ambitious goals that are set by the EU, but I thought that the two of you also highlighted that it brings spectacular investments. And of course, this whole energy transition brings a lot of challenges, as you were referring to the quest for autonomy, the quest for independence. At the same time, I think for China, it's also quite an interesting challenge to see what is the possibility for China to play a role in this whole energy transition, where at the same time, the EU is also pleading in favor of this autonomy. So lots of questions that you raised, and I thought this was a very insightful overview. Thank you very much, important contribution. Of course, Nicolas already announced that when we have this energy transition, it will be quite important also to have the funds, to have the investments, and that the EU itself will also stimulate with, for example, state aid, the energy transition towards climate neutrality. And the EU always traditionally had very stringent rules as far as state aid is concerned. So the question also arises to what extent these state aid rules can be amended or can be bent or can facilitate this energy transition. We are lucky that we have a professor of law and economics, Professor Niels Philipsen, who is connected both to Erasmus University Rotterdam and here to Maastricht University, and who is a specialist in the domain of state aid. And so Niels Philipsen will now enlighten us on the relationship between the greening of state aid and the Green Deal. Niels, please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction, Michael. I will try to share the screen now. Yes, there we are. Unfortunately, I cannot enlarge it any further because then my screen will freeze. I already tried it. So I'm not going to try it again. I hope it's large enough. Okay, so my presentation is called The Greening of State Aid under the Green Deal. So, as Professor Michael Fora just informed you, indeed, the European Union has rather strict rules on what we call state aid. So I'm first going to explain a little bit the context. What is it that these state aids are doing, and what types of government funds are still allowed, right? So the state aid policy, we can define that as EU rules, so defined at EU level, on, let's say, public spending. So spending by all kinds of public authorities, member states, but also other local governments or undertakings in which the state holds a large stake. All of that. If we have such public funding and it favors particular companies or particular sectors, then the starting point is that it is not allowed. I have to stress here the word particular, because of course the governments are free to lower taxes if they are lowered for everyone, but not if particular firms are exempted. So this is the context of the state aid provisions. These rules apply not only to subsidies, my example I already told you about this, they apply to all forms of aid, as we call it. So here are some examples. These rules apply to capital injections and private undertakings by a public authority. They apply to selective tax advantages. They apply to loans that are provided to a private undertaking at an interest rate which is lower than the market rate, and all of these situations, right? So what we can say is that the state aid policy is part of EU competition law. This is the context in which we're now. So as we all know, there are often tensions between competition rules and environmental rules, and they also exist in the context of state aid. Well, this slide is not something I would like to devote much time to. It just provides those interested the legal context. So these rules on state aid are in the most important document, the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. They have been there since the very beginning. So there's one substantive article and there's one procedural article telling us, for example, that state aid measures need to be notified in advance. And if they are violating the rules, that they are in principle not allowed and even need to be paid back by the private undertakings to the member state that is providing this subsidy or other type of aid. There are lots of other regulations as well. So there's much more hard law in all kinds of block exemptions and such. And there are literally thousands of pages of what we call soft law. And environmental guidelines also make up a large part of that. So I will come back to that in a minute. A final introductory point, why do we have this state aid policy, you may wonder. Well, the economic goal is to prevent distortions, right? Just like competition law is trying to prevent that. If government steps in and helps certain undertakings and not others, this will distort competition. It may be unfair, but even worse, it may also be inefficient, because this may affect all other sectors as well. It may affect your retailers, it may affect the ones who are selling to you as an undertaking. So we don't want that for that reason. We also do this in the EU because we don't like subsidy races between member states. If two countries like the Netherlands and Belgium would be subsidizing the same industry, nobody wins. We just waste government money to subsidize our industries to try to win the race. That would be considered a waste of resources. So that's another reason to have a supranational EU level control on government spending. And finally, in the EU, as speakers before me already stressed, we are focused on the internal market, which also means we want to create a level playing field, and we want to protect fair competition. So that's not necessarily an economic goal, but it's simply part of the EU competition law generally. Okay, another important point that the audience may want to hear is, how is this relevant for China and for Chinese investors? Well, the state aid rules apply to all undertakings based in the EU. The rules are aimed at the national governments. They are the ones who are supposed not to violate the rules on state aid, but all the undertakings can still benefit from a lot of government subsidies to the extent that they are exempted. You need to be careful, however. If you receive too many subsidies, you may have to pay them back, right? So it's important that also the private undertakings are aware to some extent of these rules. They apply, of course, to Chinese subsidiaries or subsidiaries of Chinese undertakings as well. So everyone is treated equally. As long as you are based in Europe, these rules apply to you. It also means, the other bullet point on this slide, that Chinese investors can take advantage of the state aid measures by taking into account in which areas undertakings are allowed or not allowed to receive aid, and also how much, because there are very specific rules on the amounts of aid that can be granted. Okay, yeah, this is a long slide, a lot of information. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I just give you the general way we look at different types of aid. And let's focus on the environmental aid, of course. So state aid is, as a rule, prohibited by the treaty, but there are quite a lot of exemptions to it. Two types of exemptions: the automatic types, which are not so relevant for environmental types of aid, because they include more like the aid after a natural disaster, when there's a big storm or a flooding. Then, of course, the governments can step in, and there's an automatic system that approves this aid. But there are many situations where the aid can be exempted on a discretionary basis, meaning the European Commission basically sets the rules on this. Of course, listening to stakeholders, looking at also the courts and what the courts have done in the past. But basically, the European Commission is setting the rules here. All the aid measures need to be notified and approved before they can be implemented by undertakings. The one who's doing the notification is, of course, the member state or the aid granting authority. It's not the private undertaking. Well, if the aid amounts are small, there is the de minimis regulation, and small means less than 200,000 per undertaking over 3 years, then the aid is not, there's no problem at all. The rules don't apply. 200,000 may not seem that much, but this is only the aid component. So if you get a favorable loan, it's the difference between the market rate and what you would have paid in interest, and actually the lower interest rate that you now face. There are block exemptions, and these are also relevant for environmental and energy aid. I will come to that. Yeah, there are these automatic exemptions, but I already mentioned this is not so relevant for environmental aid. So here are the two types again on one slide, and let's now focus much more on the environmental context. So we have the discretionary exemptions where the European Commission sets the rules. And in that context, we have the so-called guidelines on environmental and energy aid. They have existed since 2014, but as a result of the Green Deal, and also because the running time was actually out, it was about to expire, these guidelines are currently being revised. And actually at the moment, there's only a draft for the new guidelines. Very, very soon, we will know the version that will be effective as of 2022, so 1 January next year. And as you can expect, they have a broader scope in light of the Green Deal. So there are more types of aid that are now exempted, so allowed by EU rules. There's also the general block exemption regulation, where there are some exemptions specifically directed at environmental and energy aid. Also, these are currently under review. They're even more recently under review because the stakeholders can still respond until next week. as to the environmental, but also other parts of the general block exemption regulation. And what we see there is that compared to the previous version, we already know that there will be more exemptions for green projects aimed at the reduction of CO2 emissions, zero emission vehicles, recharging infrastructure, and others. Okay, how do these things work, right? So a few brief slides on that. So an aid measure can be exempted only when it is aimed at a market failure. That also applies to environmental aid, and it applies to other types of aid, like to save a company from bankruptcy, which is only exceptionally allowed, or aid to generate innovation, research, or aid for certain transport sectors. You always need to show that the government component in the private subsidy is necessary to solve a market failure or to serve a particular European goal. Now, this is easy for the environmental aid because it would probably qualify for both, because we talk about environmental externalities as a market failure. And we know also it's one of the key goals of the Green Deal, obviously. It's also very important that whenever there's public subsidies or any other aid, that it must change the behavior of the company, so that without the government funding, this investment would not have taken place. We call this an incentive effect. The aid must generate such an incentive effect. This is often, again, assumed for the environmental types of aid. However, of course, it's important that these amounts of the government funding are not too high, because if they are too high, they're not necessary to generate this effect. So this rule actually provides limits to how much the government is allowed to subsidize. Looking at the time, so, and finally, yeah, there are also different conditions for aid to be exempted. So if you look at these guidelines or at the block exemption regulation, you find a long document, several pages for each type of environmental aid, and it explains to you, well, exactly which types of aid and under which conditions would be allowed. So if this is about energy, what's always important is that even if fossil fuels are subsidized, because we need it at the moment, for some reason, it needs to be clear that there will be a phasing out. And also there needs to be compliance with relevant EU law. So these types of subsidies may only be short-term, and with the aim of finally replacing this type of energy with another. So how does this work? There are 8 intensities defined. So now it becomes interesting for the investors to also to look at the numbers, right? So we calculate the value of the government funding as a percentage of the total investment that we need. And the government component in that investment is called the aid intensity, and there's a maximum percentage that's defined both in the block exemption regulation and the guidelines. You may wonder what's the difference between the two. Well, if you are block exempted, that's even better, because then the aid doesn't have to be notified in advance. You just need to prove that it fulfills the conditions, and you need to register it and make sure it keeps on complying with the conditions, but you don't need to notify in advance. For the guidelines, it's different. It needs to be really exempted by the European Commission. Well, so we see now some interesting things to remember. This aid intensity, so the maximum amount that you can receive as an undertaking, is higher for certain types of environmental aid. I will give an example on the next slide. But also it's higher in the poorest areas of the EU, because there the aid that can be provided by the government may be higher than in a Western European country. And also the aid amounts are higher for small and medium-sized enterprises. But it's always important to show that the effect on competition needs to be small. That needs to be proven. Most of these measures are, by the way, not individual aid measures, because it would be very much work to notify all of that. We often have an aid scheme. So we have the rule by a local or public government. This is how we are going to implement this type of aid. And then from there on, if the aid scheme has been approved, it can be applied. Yeah, so here are the rules for the block exemption. We need to calculate the value in advance to make sure that we are below the thresholds. So that's not always easy. If you talk about a tax advantage, it's difficult to calculate in advance in euros how much that would be, right? So that's a tricky thing. For a subsidy, that's easier than for a tax advantage or a capital injection. Okay, finally, I see I have maybe 1 or 2 minutes. Let me see, I'll start with number 2, and if I don't have time, I'll go to impact example 1. And then just looking at the chair. But let's at least provide one concrete example. This is taken from these draft guidelines. So they are not formally published yet, but here you see one new category of aid that we now have added to the categories that can be exempted. This is the aid for resource efficiency and for supporting the transition towards a circular economy. So when the governments try to help private undertakings with their investments towards this goal, right? The idea is still that the investments come from the private undertaking, but of course the goals are so important that the government, as you can see, is allowed to subsidize quite a lot here, right? In this particular group, you see this basic aid intensity is 40%. So 40% of your investment could be subsidized in the large meaning of the word by a public authority. But then it can even be increased if there's a substantial eco-innovation activity. You may wonder what's that, but of course this is precisely defined in the guidelines. So if you look up these conditions apply, it could be going to 50%. If you're a small undertaking, you can add another 20%. So if you can calculate, we see we are at 70% of the total amount of the investment. And then if you're in a so-called assisted region of the EU, so this is one of the poorer areas compared to the EU average in terms of GDP. Also, that's carefully defined. There are maps exactly showing you which area belongs where in the assistance regions categories. But if you would be in the poorest area of the EU, you would be a small undertaking and you would do a substantial eco-innovation. If we calculate, we end up with 50 plus 20 plus perhaps even 15 is a very substantial amount of the investment. As long as we can still show that without this investment, we would not have, without the government help, we would not have this investment. Okay, so this is how the calculations work. There's another example that I had here, but I think the idea is clear enough. But just to show you another category, so you know what's in the guidelines. Something new, again, as a result of the Green Deal, is that we are now also can exempt aid for the improvement of the energy efficiency of buildings. Professor de Sadelaer was already referring to this example. You see the basic aid intensities are a bit different. The calculations are slightly different. So this is how it works. You really need to look into the document for the specific type of aid to see how much government help is allowed, so that we still consider this important enough, even though it may restrict competition to some extent. I'll stop here. It's pretty clear that the state aid rules, which have always been pretty strict, have become more lenient, particularly for the context of environmental aid. So this is what I was trying to inform you about. I hope that I was clear enough. Thank you. I give the floor back to the chair, Michael.
Professor Niels, you are always crystal clear. I thank you very much. Also, this is always very enlightening and a pleasure to listen to. It looks so complicated, but then when I listen to you, this whole complicated domain of state aid seems to be much easier than it actually is. Thank you very much. I think that it also fits perfectly into the topic, as you show nicely the trade-off between restrictions on competition that could be caused by state aid, but also the advantages that it could stimulate investments. And I think for our Chinese colleagues, very important, that, of course, also Chinese companies could benefit from the state aid, for example, in eco-innovation, as you were mentioning. And I also wanted to tell all of you participants that the PPTs will all be put on the website of Metro, so later you can consult them. You notice also that there was, in addition to the English, always a Chinese translation. Also that has been done, greatly appreciated by Lan Ying. Lan Ying is a visiting scholar from Wuhan University, working there at the Research Institute of Environmental Law, together with the well-known Professor Qin Tianbao. And she is now a year at Metro and has helped us a lot. Dear colleagues, we hear already in the background, I would say, a very famous scholar who almost needs no introduction, certainly not in China, because he is a world famous person, not only known in China. When I talk about Professor Wang Canfa, everyone says, but that is the man from the Foundation for the Center for Legal Aid to Pollution Victims. And of course, it is a professor at Zhengfa Daxue, the well-known China University of Political Science and Law, but someone who also spent time in America. And believe it or not, he was on the first page of Time magazine. So he's not only famous in China, but this is a world famous person for his environmental activism in China. It's a good friend of mine. Wang Laoshi wo非常高兴你正在这儿，很高兴. And I'm very happy that our good friend could join us today. It's also striking. I looked at the number of participants, and then when Professor Wang Canfa comes, we suddenly see the number of participants increasing. People are all eager. And we see on the background, no one less than Dr. Lu Mangxing, who popped in for a minute and is so kind to help us. Dr. Lu Mangxing did a PhD that she defended at Maastricht University a few years ago. And you see that Dr. Lu Mangxing is there to assist Wang Laoshi in the lecture that he will give. Wang Laoshi will talk in Chinese, but we have to some extent provided some translation in English. 我非常高兴，王老师，现在你可以开始，谢谢你。
Thank you, Mike.
先这个，
分享，然后。Hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. Today I will have a speak about the policy and the legal implementation of the Chinese 2C target aligning with the European targets. My English not well. I have to speak with the Chinese. 我今天呢要讲这样的几个问题，但我准备的内容呢是比较多，但是呢里边的一些东西我可以不讲，你们以后看 PPT 里边的内容就可以了。那么第一个问题，我想给大家讲一下，就是说告诉大家，就碳达峰和碳中和，已经成为中国政府和人民必须达到的目标和愿景。那么为什么说是必须达到的呢？这个呢，就是有中国的国家最高领导人那个习近平在2020年9月22日，在第75届联合国大会一般性辩论上就郑重地宣布，中国将提高国家自主贡献力度，采取更加有力的政策和措施，二氧化碳排放力争在2030年前达到峰值，努力争取2060年前实现碳中和。那么这个是一个中国领导人的承诺。那么这种承诺是在中国是要已经在某些方面把它变成了政策，那么还要进一步成为法律。 而且呢，不光最高领导人来宣布，然后呢，中国的政府工作报告，2021年的中国政府工作报告也谈到要扎实做好碳达峰、碳中和各项工作，制定2030年碳排放达峰行动方案。实际上，这个方案中国现在已经做了。然后再一个就是2021年3月15日召开的中央财经委员会第9次会议，要求把碳达峰、碳中和纳入生态文明建设整体布局，拿出抓贴有痕的劲头，如期实现2030年前碳达峰、2060年前碳中和的目标。我讲的这3个就是他们的承诺，都是特别权威的。但是实际上有了这个目标了，但是呢，在中国碳达峰、碳中和目标的实现任务还是非常艰巨的。刚才呢，欧方的这个你们那边就讲到，就是欧盟在2050年实现碳中和，已经是一个雄心壮志了。但是呢，中国呢，在这方面要达到这样的一个目标啊，可能比欧盟的困难更大。那么为什么这么说呢？一个是中国的排放量巨大，减排时间紧，幅度大。我们如果跟欧盟相比，那么欧盟呢，在上世纪90年代，二氧化碳排放就已经达到45亿吨的峰值。那么预测呢，中国二氧化碳排放值将达到106亿吨左右。但是呢，有的说，如果核算成当量，中国可能最高达到140亿吨左右，它是欧盟的2.4倍。那么按照欧盟本世纪中叶实现碳中和目标，它的其碳达峰到碳中和历经了60年，而中国呢，要从碳达峰到碳中和，实践只有30年的时间，因此中国面临着比发达国家时间更紧。幅度更大的减排要求，特别是给欧盟来讲，那么中国呢，就是说要在30年内做完欧盟在60年内做的事情。那么再一个困难呢，就是中国仍然面临着经济发展解决每年上千万就业人口的负担。我们都知道中国是一个人口的大国。中国呢仍然还是发展中国家，尽管有一些国家认为中国不是发展中国家，但是呢，他们只看到了北京、上海、广州、深圳这些大的地方，他没有去这些比较贫穷的地方去看。其实中国仍然还是发展中国家。那么每年光就业人口就有上千万，就相当于你们欧盟的一些比较小的国家的整个的人口。所以呢，解决这个就业人口，那就需要有大量的生产，还是要发展。那么这个负担是非常大的。另外呢，就是各种利益关系需要调整，比如像不同的地区发展非常不平衡。那么你看这个不平衡，我在后面有一个表。这个是就业人口的数，就是每年你看最多的时候，一年要解决1361万人的就业问题。那么呢，在后边一个表，这个是地区发展的不平衡。你比如像北京市，在2020年人均 GDP 为甘肃省的，这是中国西北的一个省，4.57倍。那你看北京达到了多少？164929元人民币，而低的甘肃省只有甘肃省我这个共享的才只有36039元，所以呢，就是这个非常不平衡。怎么过不去了？我要往前翻另外一个呢，就是不同行业的减排任务也不同。你比如像有的行业可能比较容易减，但是呢，像中国的发电行业，他们基本上用的都是煤来发电，而这个煤要想要把它变成 就是碳中和，那就要付出很大的那个努力。当然呢，有的行业可能比较好一些，因为这个是不同的行业的那个减排问题，比如像农林牧渔业，那么它的减排的量就比较少。但是呢，制造业整个红色的是制造业，中国的制造业在它所占的比例，就制造业在产值或者是对世界的贡献，占全世界的30%。所以呢，整个世界生产的他们制造业有30%在中国。所以呢，在这种情况下，它的一次性的这个排放量碳排放量就特别大。当然，采矿业也是一个非常大的，中国的采矿业占的比例也在20%左右。另外一个呢，就是中国尚未在根本上解决环境污染和生态破坏问题。需要减污降碳与生态保护同时推进，环保投入巨大。就是在欧盟，你们已经基本上解决了这种明显的环境污染的问题，但是在中国，现在 PM2.5对中国的那个影响还是非常大，一到冬天都要采取非常非常严厉的措施，才能够达到不造成特别严重的这种污染的程度。那么围绕这样，中国呢就需要减少污染物的排放，还要解决生态破坏，还要进行降碳，这样同时推进，环保的投入就非常大。你看中国在这个2016年到2019年，全国节能环保财政支出了2.4万亿元，这些财政投入引导和撬动大量的社会资本。参与到各地生态环境保护当中，“十三五”期间，环保总投入有望超过17万亿元人民币。你看这个呢，图表是一个各年的中国的财政的环保投入，到了2017年就有了明显的那个增长。还有一个呢，就是中国要实现2碳目标遇到的这个困难，就是减碳、固碳、封碳技术、新能源技术缺乏。就是中国这个与中国的与欧盟相比，中国低碳技术开发起步较晚，与发达国家相比，所持有的低碳技术专利数量差距很大。你比如像这个2010年到2019年，绿色能源技术专利申请的总数，日本、美国、德国，像韩国要比中国人口少很多，也小，但是呢，都领先于中国。而且更重要的是呢，中国缺乏核心知识产权，就是最重要的关键技术不在中国手里，很多核心知识产权由国外的公司或者研究机构所掌握。这个呢是下边一个表，我是找出来一个，就是通过检索一个就是申请的专利的，就是有关低碳技术的专利，中国呢还只排在第5位，还不如那个德国，还甚至不如韩国。那么在这种情况下，中国呢就是在那个立法怎么来促进2碳的实现，那么如果没有法律的保障，在这样困难的情况下，是很难实现2碳目标的。那么现在中国2碳政策和立法的现状是什么样呢？我们先说政策，中国的两碳政策的框架。中国为碳达峰和碳中和现在已经制定了一系列的政策，其中最权威的政策文件是2011年9月22日，不是这个呢，这个应该是错的，应该是2021年，2021年9月22日，中共中央、国务院发布的关于完整、准确、全面贯彻新发展理念，做好碳达峰、碳中和工作的意见。那么它体现的政策框架为这样的几个内容：一个是政策目标， 这个政策目标呢是到2025年，这个政策目标分3步走。第一步就是到2025年的目标，绿色低碳循环发展的经济体系初步形成，重点行业能源利用效率大幅提升。那么这个提升怎么提升呢？叫单位国内生产总值能耗要比2020年下降13.5%，也就是说在5年时间内，这个能耗要下降13.5%。然后呢，单位国内生产总值二氧化碳排放要比2020年下降18%。非化石能源消费比重要达到20%左右，也就是这个绿色能源要达到20%左右的使用量，森林覆盖率要达到24.1%，森林蓄积量达到180亿立方米，为实现碳达峰、碳中和奠定坚实基础。这是在2025年之前，中国要达到这样的一个要求。那么第二个目标呢，就是到2030年的目标。就是经济社会发展全面绿色转型取得显著成效，重点耗能行业能源利用效率达到国际先进水平，单位国内生产总值能耗大幅下降，单位国内生产总值二氧化碳的排放要比2005年下降65%以上，所以这个目标是很大的。非化石能源消费比重要达到25%左右，风电、太阳能发电总装机容量要达到12亿千瓦以上，森林覆盖率达到25%左右，森林蓄积量达到190亿立方米，二氧化碳排放量达到峰值，并实现稳中有降。就是这是一个30年的目标，实际上就是说它2碳的目标之一，就是碳达峰。那么第3个目标就是到2060年，绿色低碳循环发展的经济体系和清洁低碳安全高效的能源体系全面建立，能源利用效率达到国际先进水平，非化石能源消费比重达到80%以上。那么能够达到80%以上这个非化石能源，那就是实际上中国那个基本上就没有这种那个很严重的碳排放的企业了。那么碳中和目标顺利实现，生态文明建设取得丰硕成果，开创人与自然和谐共生新境界。我看你们这个什么欧盟的雄心，我觉得中国的这个雄心也是很大的，而且呢就是要开创一个人与自然和谐共生的新境界，这个确实是不容易的。那么这个呢就是围了这上面是一个整个的目标，那么围绕实现这个目标，中国制定了一系列的政策，而这个比如像2007年中国就制定了国务院关于印发中国应对气候变化国家方案的通知，那么来规定了一些这个措施，实现这个减排的措施。然后呢，中国的这个2012年1月，中国银监会实际上就是管理银行的机构，也制定了银监会关于绿色信贷指引的通知，要发展绿色信贷。那么到2014年6月，中国银监会办公厅又发了一个绿色信贷实施情况观念评价的指标，就促进银行、促进金融机构要绿色化。那么到了2014年9月，国家能源局又发了一个关于进一步落实分布式光伏发电有关政策的通知。当然这个呢发的文件很多，像国务院在2016年也发了一个文件，到2016年国务院还发了“十三五”生态环境保护规划当中也规定要推动低碳循环、治污减排、监测监控。那么在2016年8月，那个银行也发了一个关于构建绿色金融体系的指导意见，这些呢都是政策性文件。那么最新的文件是这样的几个，就是2021年发的，一个是关于统筹，这是生态环境部发的， 关于统筹和加强应对气候变化与生态环境保护相关工作的指导意见。那么2021年5月，生态环境部又发了一个关于加强高能耗高排放建设项目生态环境源头防控的指导意见。那么在2021年9月，也就今年9月，国家发改委也发了一个国家发改委关于印发完善能源消费强度和总量控制双控制度方案的这个通知。特别是就是在2021年9月，中共中央、国务院关于完整、准确、全面贯彻新发展理念，做好碳达峰、碳中和工作的意见。这个呢，就属于什么呢？中国因为是党的领导是核心，然后呢，国务院是政府，那么两个一个是党，一个是政府的最高机构，发了这个文件，那么也就把它作为一项最重要的政策。那么在2021年11月，为了进一步来防止为了减少碳的排放和减少污染物排放，然后呢，中共中央、国务院又印发了关于深入打好污染防治攻坚战这样的一个意见。这个意见虽然是一个防污染的文件，但是呢，也是明确了规定中国污染物的排放和碳排放，以及在2030年要达到峰值的这样的一个要求。那么政策，我刚才上面讲的这些文件，那么我们把它总一下，都是有哪些政策呢？就是一个是政策措施，政策措施第一点就是要推进经济社会发展全面绿色转型。那么这个绿色转型，我就和你们欧盟的绿色新政啊，就是有一个应该是一样的意思，就是经济社会全面绿色转型，那肯定就是新的政策呀。再一个就是深度调整产业结构，就是这个产业结构不变，那么碳的排放是很难减少的。所以呢，第二点就是要深度调整产业结构。第三点就是加快构建清洁低碳、安全高效的能源体系，就是在能源上要建立清洁低碳的能源。第四个就是加快推进低碳交通运输体系，要改变现在的交通用能的状况。那么政策措施的再一个措施就是提升城乡建设绿色低碳发展质量，就是城市和乡村建设都要绿色发展。然后呢，再一个就是从科技方面、科学技术方面要加强绿色低碳重大科技攻关和推广应用。还有一个呢，持续巩固提升碳汇能力，实际上就是通过这种森林碳汇、海洋碳汇等等的来固碳。再一个就是提高对外开放绿色低碳发展水平，实际上呢要给国外更多的合作。那么再一点就是健全法律法规标准和统计监测体系，这是几个政策措施。那么这些措施通过哪些工具来执行呢？就通过这些政策工具来执行。一个是完善投资政策，要鼓励绿色投资，国家要对于这个绿色发展要加强政府的投资。还有一个呢，就积极发展绿色金融。现在就是银行已经我前面讲到了，就是银行已经出了一系列的政策文件，要发展绿色金融。第三个呢，就是完善财税价格政策，就是说对于这些减少碳的排放的，要给予减税免税。然后呢，对于排放碳比较多的，要进行提高税收。第四个方面就是工具要推进市场化建设，比如像建设碳市场，然后呢进行碳的碳排放权的交易。现在呢，中国已经建立了 这个在上海建立了交易所。那么第二个方面就是在法律方面的框架，就是中国因为政策毕竟是政策，它必须变成法律才能强迫人们来执行。那么这儿呢，我给大家看一下，就是中国的法律体系的框架。我觉得我这一个框架啊，可以用最简略的方式来了解中国的法律法规体系的形成。就是说中国的立法整体上分为2级，就是国家级立法和地方级的立法。而国家级的立法呢，最高的是宪法，然后就是法律，当然国际条约也可以构成中国的法律。然后呢，是吧？下面就行政法规、行政规章，然后呢地方级的，这样呢从上到下，就是下一级的不能与上一级的相抵触。你看了我这个图，就可以对中国的法律体系有一个最简略的这个 picture。然后呢，再一个就是中国关于2碳的立法，首先就是2009年全国人大通过了一个关于积极应对气候变化的这个决议，提出要把加强应对气候变化的相关立法作为形成和完善中国特色社会主义法律体系的一项重要任务，纳入立法工作议程。然后呢，再一个就是中国有关2碳的立法，就在可再生能源、循环经济促进法、清洁生产促进法、节约能源法都把节能降碳减污作为它的立法宗旨，并规定了各种鼓励和管理制度与措施。那么再一个就是有关2碳的立法，比如像国务院有关主管部门制定了一系列有关管理碳排放的行政规章和规范性文件。那么比如生态环保部制定的碳排放权交易管理办法试行，像国家质检总局、国家发改委发布了节能低碳产品那个认证管理办法。还有这个几个部委，财政部等部委发展的那个发布的中国清洁能源机制基金管理办法。然后呢，还有发改委发布的节能低碳技术推广管理暂行办法。还有特别重要的是中国的一些地方已经制定了一些地方立法，比如像那个发布了一些地方性的法规，像天津市在今年9月刚刚发布了一个天津市碳达峰碳中和促进条例，就是国家还没有这样的一个条例，还没有这样的一个法律的时候，天津市就制定了。深圳市在2019年8月29日就修订了深圳经济特区碳排放管理若干规定。南昌市也制定了低碳发展促进条例，石家庄市也制定了低碳促进发展条例。再一个就是一些地方发布了对气候变化和碳排放交易的地方性法规，比如像青海啊、山西青海省人民政府、山西市人民政府、上海市那个政府、深圳市政府都颁发了碳排放交易的这样的一些规定。当然还包括湖北省、广东省、福建省都有碳排放交易的这样的地方性的规章。那么中国有关2碳立法的主要内容是可以概括归纳为这几个方面，一个是明确了中国2025年、2030年、2066年3个阶段碳达峰碳中和的目标。那么再一个就提出了实现2碳目标的基本原则，就全国统筹、节约优先、双轮驱动、内外畅通、防范风险。第3个就建立了一系列的制度措施，比如像鼓励可再生能源发展制度、循环经济制度、清洁生产制度、节能制度、碳排放权交易制度、能源消费强度和总量双控制度、节能和减碳目标政府考核制度等。那么现在呢，中国的碳政策和立法也面临着一些挑战。这个挑战呢，第一个就是中国的碳达峰和碳中和的政策和立法还不够健全。那么不健全表现在哪里呢？就中国现在还没有一个专门的碳达峰的法律，碳达峰和碳中和的法律。 也没有一个应对气候变化法。所以呢，这个是中国目前在立法上的一个缺陷，需要尽快的制定这样的立法。再一个，现有政策和立法碎片化，还有一个就是立法的健全和完善得需要一定的时间，在短期内很难制定很全面的立法。那么中国两碳和政策和立法面临的挑战就缺乏有效的管理和激励制度，比如缺乏进展报告制度、碳评价制度、信息发布制度、年度报告制度、责任追究制度。另外呢，中国还没有建立有效的监督管理和协调机制。那么未来中国两碳政策和立法应该怎么发展呢？会往哪个方向发展呢？从现在的目前的状况来看，中国呢那个两碳政策和法律法规体系将逐步的健全，比如像综合性的框架立法、应对气候变化法将被列入立法计划，单行性的立法，比如碳中和促进法也被提上议事日程，已经有人大代表、政协委员来提建议立这个法律。再一个就碳排放权交易条例不久将会出台，还有一系列的两碳行政规章，就是由部门来制定。地方性的双碳立法将进一步得到发展。立法的内容主要会包括明确立法目标，立法目的，设立明确的目标，强调政府目标的责任，建立分工明确的管理体制，确立一些重要的管理制度，然后确立各个主体的义务，然后建立严密的实施程序，然后呢就是严格违法责任，就对违法的要严格追究责任。那么最后的这个一点就是中国目标与欧盟目标的一致性。我认为刚才我听了欧盟的一些专家你们那边讲的，我觉得中国的目标与欧盟的目标在很大程度上是一致的。一个是中国和欧盟都是油气资源极度缺乏的地区，通过应对气候变化、促进能源转型是双方可持续发展的必有之路。比如像我查了一下资料，就中国的石油依赖度现在2020年已经达到了73.6%，天然气的对外进口的依赖度已经达到了43%，而欧盟对外的石油依赖度达到87%，天然气的对外进口的依赖度达到60%。那么在这种情况下，中国和欧盟都面临着就是能源进口的巨大压力，要花很多钱去买人家的石油和天然气。那么如果能源转型成功，那么这一笔钱就可以省了。而且呢，就像刚才一些尼格勒教授讲的，就是可能会改变地缘政治的格局。中国应该也有这方面的考虑，因为中国现在对外的能源依赖度依赖太高，那么也会制约中国经济的发展和政治的意愿。那么第二个就是欧盟的只有一个地球理念和中国的人类命运共同体理念具有一致性。那么另外还有就是欧盟的绿色新政给中国的生态文明建设也应该是一致的，这种追求这种理念都是一致的。然后呢，第三个呢，欧盟的目标在2050年是碳中和，中国呢是2060年碳中和。这个目标虽然中国比欧盟晚了10年，但是呢，从整个发展历程来讲，中国的速度还要比欧盟快，因为欧盟在碳达峰到碳中和用了60年时间，而中国呢30年时间就必须达到，所以呢这个目标应该还是很一致的。另外呢，中国在发展风能、光伏发电、碳捕集、碳封存和节能技术等方面现在还比较落后，而欧洲在这方面是发展的比较先进的，然后呢这里边具有互补性。那么最后一点呢，就是中国应对气候变化立法较多的可以借鉴欧盟国家立法的经验， 比如我在参与中国应对气候变化法的起草的过程当中，就考察了英国的应对气候英国的气候变化法，然后呢也考察了欧盟的气候立法，而且呢也到德国考察过他们的立法。所以呢，中国目前在气候变化立法方面借鉴的最多的就是欧盟国家的立法经验。所以在这方面，我觉得我们都是目标一致，然后采取的措施也是一致的，而且呢有共同的这个追求。所以呢，在这方面，我觉得具有很强的一致性。好，我的这个报告就到这儿，谢谢大家 ，Thank you very much。
We thank you very much. And I'm happy that you had the Time magazine issue on your last sheet. Thank you so much. Now, I think you provided us with an impressive, wonderful overview of what's going on in China. Again, when you hear this, you see, of course, similarities. Some people already reacted in the chat by saying, hey, it looks like the Chinese climate policy is to some extent similar to what we have seen as far as the EU Green Deal is concerned. But of course, there are differences as well. You pointed us in detail at all the regulations. So those who think that nothing would be going on as far as climate change policy in China is concerned, they are wrong. You showed it not only at the central level, but also at the regional and local level. So many steps are taken, but you also showed us how many challenges there still are ahead. Thank you so much, Wang Lauscher. It was really very interesting, very insightful, excellent contribution to the seminar. Now I turn to Nicolas de Sadeleer because it's a bit shorter than we had expected, but we still have a few moments before the break for some questions. So if you want, I again repeat, put your questions in the chat. I also repeat that the PPTs will be made available via the website of Metro. The same is true for the recording. Some people asked us whether the recording will be available. The answer is yes. Now for the Q&A, Nicolas, please.
Yes, I'm taking the first question. As Dr. Damjanovic stressed, the EU aims at being self-sufficient, reducing its import of natural resources and fossil fuels, and these trends enhance the EU visions of its strategic autonomy. Does this trend run counter to the free movement of goods principle that underpins the 1994 GATT Treaty and the TBT Treaty? Ivana, could you answer that question? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So I would say that the core principle of the EU trade policy remains openness. So when we talk about trade policy, I would distinguish that from the more geopolitical talk of the current Commission. So trade still remains a very important aspect of EU external policy, but what the EU is trying to do is to make that policy more green. So focusing more on sustainable development provisions in its trade agreements, in the investment agreement with China, as it will be mentioned later on. So I don't think that the idea is to reduce trade. The idea is really to have less energy dependency on others. So, and I think it was very well mentioned also in the final presentation of Professor Kanpa that the EU has no natural resources in terms of gas and oil and so on. So it really is dependent on importing a lot of fossil fuels, but the EU has other resources. So it has forests, it has agriculture. So the idea here is to be less energy and resources dependent on others, which doesn't necessarily mean reducing trade. and of course having more green and more sustainable value supply chains.
Thank you very much indeed for this very clear answer. A question regarding state aids. So I'm a Chinese investor, and I would like to take advantage of the state aid scheme that has been explained by Niels Philipsen. You mentioned in the last slide the eco-innovation activity. What does the European Commission encompasses within these terms? Niels, could you answer that question, please?
Yes, I have to unmute myself first to answer this question. Yes, to answer the question very specifically, I think, Nicola, we need to look into the document. I'm trying to open it at the moment, because this is really, all of this is very specific. There are like 13 categories, some of which are entirely new, both in the book exemption regulation and in the guidelines. So I think I need a few minutes to check it, and then I can put the answer in the chat. But I'm not going to say something out of my head that may not be entirely on point. So, but this is the question that you ask already stresses the importance of really looking at the headings, because there's a clear table of contents, and then going to the categories of aid to see what it really entails, because there are so many finesses there. It's impossible for me to give now a clear-cut answer. Even more important, we don't know yet if what I can answer now is also going to be in the final version, although the chances are very high that they will be.
True. Yes, perfect. Thanks. A question regarding the enforcement of Chinese legislation to Mr. Wang Kanfa. So according to the participant, local industry might resist changes. Does Professor Kanfa see any positive trend in enforcement? Could you answer that shortly, Professor Kanfa? Or do I have to repeat the question? Is that clear enough?
Okay. 就是中国已经制定了这么多的政策，那么确实是有一个实施的问题。那么刚才问的说那个2000那个时代杂志当时采访我，那是2007年了。
Yes, as mentioned by the guest speaker, that enforcement of environment policy and regulation is indeed a key question in China's environmental law. But as Nielsen mentioned, that the article in Time magazine actually is published in 2007.
那么在13年前，中国的环境的法律在实施的过程当中，确实遇到了很多的障碍。但是呢，2012年中国的18大以后，2014年修改了环境保护法，现在就是法律实施的状况有了非常大的转变。
Because this is after 13 years since 2007, it is indeed a big improvement regarding the enforcement of China's environmental law, and particularly after the revision to Environment Protection Law in 2014. And we saw there is a positive development in China's environmental law enforcement.
过去他们说环境保护的法律像橡皮图章。是软法，然后呢是没有牙齿的老虎。但是2014年以后，社会上普遍认为中国的环境法已经是长了牙齿的老虎。
In fact, before 2014, the Chinese environmental law was described as a paper tiger without teeth. However, after the revision to Environment Protection Law in 2014, we have saw the changes in the enforcement of China's environmental law, and somebody described this phenomenon as a tiger with teeth.
所以中国现在环保政策和法律的实施状况要比10多年前好了很多。
Yes, now we keep positive about the enforcement of China's environmental policy and regulation nowadays.
就是尽管现在中国已经提出了碳达峰、碳中和的这样的目标，肯定会在地方上会有很多的困难。但是呢，从这些刚才我列的地方的立法当中，你们可以看到，在地方上还是非常积极的。
Although we may expect the challenges and maybe resistance from the local government and the local industry, however, from my presentation, you can see, and we have listed a lot of the local experiment in developing their local regulation and policies to achieve their carbon targets.
特别是中国政府如果把这个碳排放、碳达峰、碳中和的这个目标列入对政府考核的目标里边，将会有非常大的推动作用。
Especially if the central government has listed their carbon targets as the evaluation of the local government performance, it will be very effective for the local government to enforce these targets and policies.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So there is two questions to me. The first question regards the free allowances that are granted, that are conferred to the European aviation sector. So far, the ETS scheme encompasses aviations, be it international aviations or flights within the EU. The international flights are not falling actually on ETS schemes. However, the internal flights, or flight from Berlin to Roma, is falling within the scope of the ETS scheme. So the Commission is intent upon removing the carbon leakage derogation with respect to aviation. Of course, it means that companies like Lufthansa or Air France operating these internal flights within Europe are likely to face a more significant competition from companies that are based otherwise. But nevertheless, if let's see, Etihad company organize a flight from Berlin to Roma, it will be subject to the obligation to purchase allowances. So there won't be a major problem in that connection. The second question is about the risk that the transition toward a very low or zero emissions standards for cars and vans might lead to a greater level of consumption of cars. So one has to be aware that according to life cycle analysis, electric cars have an environmental impact, be it batteries, be it the tires, be it the steel being produced. So the electric cars of the future are not neutral. Regarding the financial support to the car industry, of course, I refer to the speech given by Niels Philipsen. This support falls within the scope of state aid regulations, in particular the state aids regarding the car industry. And these guidelines are subject to modification in the near future to flesh out the Green Deal objectives. So so far I cannot take any more questions. We need to take a 5 minutes break and 10 minutes break, and we will restart soon with the second session. I give the floor to Michael Ford, my colleague Michael Ford.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, for leading the Q&A. I just wanted to thank again all the speakers, Nicolas, Ivana, Niels, and Professor Wang Canfa. I thought we had very interesting, enlightening contributions. I thank also everyone for contributing to the questions and to the Q&A. Now we will break really 10 minutes, not more than that, because we start again in European time. It is 11:20, because we still have 4 interesting lectures coming. So just 10 minutes break. Woman Siusi, Shefenjum, Siusi. Okay.
And
Yuan, you can start.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Michael. Good morning to colleagues and participants in Europe, and good afternoon to participants in China, and good evening to people from Australia. It is my pleasure to chair this second session, which we will focus on the impact of the EU Green Deal on China in the field, especially in trade and investment. Some of you may wonder, I come from the Erasmus University Rotterdam, and how why I'm involved in a seminar that organized by Maastricht University. Well, this is of course due to Michael, like the dean of the law school of Maastricht University just mentioned a few hours ago. When Michael ask you something you can never say no. Well, it's a joke, but actually, you know, Michael is also a professor at our Erasmus Law School, and our law school have a very close relation. Of course, our relation with China is also very solid and broad. So it is really my pleasure to take this position to chair today's seminar. Of course, the most important and attracting me to do this work is the topic we are discussing today. The EU Green Deal is a new initiative, and it's very ambitious. It's really need not only EU's effort, but also international cooperation. And I think today's seminar focus on the impact on at least our session focused on the impact on China. It shows our European colleagues really take China as a very important partner in going ahead with implementation of this Green Deal. So, and also Michael mentioned, this is the first seminar actually discuss about the impact of the Green Deal with external partners of the EU. So, and we have the conference organizer have selected 4 topics to be addressed in our second session. We will start with Professor Xiao Jun from the Law School of Wuhan University. Of course, Chinese in China all know that Wuhan University is really play a leading role in research and education in the field of international law and in environmental law. Many of you know there are professors there, and Professor Xiao Jun is specialized in international investment law and international trade law. And also he got his PhD in Germany, so he also always followed the new development of investment law and trade law in Europe. So we are very happy today. He will give us a presentation about the environmental aspect of the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on investment, the so-called TAI. After that, we will have Ivana and Nicola talk about the very concrete issue of the carbon border adjustment measure and its impact on China. We all know that this carbon border adjustment mechanism is very new and it's very practical. And so it's not only an academic exploration of this topic is interesting, but also has really very significant practical impact. So we are very looking forward to their presentation. Afterwards, of course, we will have Professor Ellen Foss from Maastricht University. She will deal with the topic, which is really, I'm sure, interesting for everybody, because it's really related to our daily life, our survival. It's about how to make the food system fair, healthy, and environmental friendly. So we are also very anxious to hear her story. Our last speaker today will be Professor Nicholas, and he will talk about the circular economy with its relation with trade. I think this is a very controversial issue, but also it is a very serious issue when we talk about the Green Deal. It's really also need not only the EU imposed some new measures, but also actually it bring new thinking for academics, how we take this moment also to change, to reflect that the like the international trade principles, and whether it's the free trade principle need to be redefined, and in order to comply with the new development. So I think that Nicola will give us some, will enlighten us on this subject. So now let me, without further ado, I will give the floor to Professor Xiaojun from Wuhan University.
Thank you very much, Professor Yuan, and for the kindly introduction. So my topics is the environmental profile in CAI. So the negotiation of a bilateral investment treaty between China and the EU started in January 2014. On the last day of 2020, after 7 years and 35 rounds of negotiations, the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, the so-called CAI, has been concluded. Because there are already 25 bids concluded by China with 26 EU member states, so a single China-EU agreement by replacing those bids would be a great step forward for the coherent international protection for investment. But the current CAI does not include rules on investment protection and investor-state dispute settlement, the main element of the traditional bids. So possibly due to EU's insistence on investment court system, so that the CAI is stuck halfway, as some scholars commented. On the other hand, regarding the rules on investment and sustainable development, including environment protection, the CAI is a great step forward indeed, particularly for China's treaty practice. Environmental issues have been encapsulated in the section Investment and Sustainable Development of the CAI. This section consists of 4 subsections, which are context and objectives, investment and environment, investment label, and mechanism to address differences. So with regard to environmental issues, subsection 1 provides guiding principles, including that environment protection, economic development, and social development as the 3 dimensions of sustainable development are interdependent and mutually reinforcing. Subsection 4 provides the dispute settlement mechanism, although the contracting parties intentionally avoid to use these terms. For purpose of today's meeting, subsection 2 is most important, which contains substantive rules on investment and environment. There are 2 groups of obligations in subsection 2, namely obligations related to domestic legislation and obligations regarding the implementation of multilateral environmental conventions. The first group, the obligations related to domestic legislation, includes, first, each party's right to regulate environmental issues is confirmed, in particular to determine its policies and priorities, and to establish its own levels of domestic environmental protection. This is the so-called right to regulate clause in Article 1. Second, each party should not waive or derogate from its environmental laws as encouragement for investment. This is the so-called non-derogation clause in Article 2.3. And third, each party shall note through a sustained or recurring course of action or inaction, fail to effectively enforce its environmental laws as encouragement for investment. This is the so-called non-enforcement clause in Article 2.4. The phrase as an encouragement for investment means that the non-derogation and non-enforcement obligations are conditioned on intended effects on investment. So in order to determine whether there is a violation of these obligations, an intent to affect investment is necessary, but actual effects need not to be shown. If the related clause use the phrase in a manner affecting trade or investment, such as the EU-Vietnam FTA Article 13.3.2, a non-derogation clause, trade or investment effects must occur in the relation between the contracting parties. In both circumstances, a link with trade or investment is required. It's noteworthy that such link requirements are different in FTAs concluded by the EU in recent years. In comparison with Article 13.3.2, the non-enforcement clause in the following paragraph, namely the Article 13.3.3 in the EU-Vietnam FTA, uses the phrase as an encouragement. Like CAI, the EU's FTA with Canada, Mexico, and Mercosur use the phrase to encourage trade or investment. On the other hand, in FTAs with Korea, Japan, and Singapore, the link requirement is affecting trade or investment between the parties. The reason for choosing one or another link in a particular FTA is not so clear, neither from the temporal nor development perspective. It's also noteworthy that in a dispute between the United States and Guatemala under the framework of FTA between them, based on a similar non-enforcement clause using the term in a manner affecting trade between the parties, the complaints of the United States had failed, partly because the United States cannot prove that a cause of inaction by Guatemala was in a manner affecting trade. Possibly because of that experience, the contracting states of the USMCA, namely the United States, Canada, and Mexico, add two footnotes. First footnote is a waiver or derogation is in a manner affecting trade or investment between the parties if it involves, first, a person or industry that produces a good or supplies a service traded between the parties, or has an investment in the territory of the party that has failed to comply with this obligation, or second, a person or industry that produces a good or supplies a service that competes in the territory with a good or service of another party. The second footnote is, for purpose of dispute settlement, a panel should presume that a failure is in a manner affecting trade or investment between the parties unless the responding party demonstrates otherwise. In comparison with those footnotes, could the non-derogation and non-enforcement clauses using the phrase as an encouragement be deemed as another way to ease the burden of proof for complainant, although not so clearly as those footnotes in the USMCA? Since each party has the right to determine its priorities for environmental issues, Article 2.5 of the CAI explicitly recognizes that a good faith decision regarding the allocation of resources in accordance with the party's priorities does not constitute a violation of Article 2.4 4, namely the non-enforcement clause. Other EU's FTAs mentioned above does not have such a clause, so it can be seen as an innovation of the CAI. The second group, the obligations regarding the implementation of multilateral environmental conventions, includes each party committed to effectively implement the multilateral environmental agreements to which it's a party. And there is also specific commitment regarding the climate change, namely effectively implement the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, in particular the nationally determined contribution, the so-called NDC. Among EU's FTAs, only CAI and the EU-Mexico Agreement explicitly mention the NDC. So this could be seen as another highlight of CAI's environmental rules. It's also consistent with China's commitments in dealing with global climate change. As introduced by Professor Wang, in September 2020, China formally pledged to achieve the peak of carbon emission by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. Nowadays, carbon neutrality and emission peak has become catchphrases in China. On the other hand, some of the EU's FTAs, for example, with Vietnam, with Mexico, Mercosur, contain provisions on other environmental issues such as biodiversity, sustainable management of forests, of fisheries, and so on. From this point of view, the environmental contribution of CAI is limited. So CAI is the first standalone investment treaty concluded by the EU after the Lisbon Treaty. Others are investment chapters of the FTA, although the EU-Vietnam Investment Protection Agreement is not a chapter as such, but it has been negotiated and concluded under the framework of an FTA. So even for the EU, CAI is the first time that a sustainable development chapter incorporated into the standalone investment treaty. CAI does not include sections on investment protection and investor-state dispute settlement. Hence, it's still a work in progress. Nevertheless, the sustainable development section makes this incomplete CAI an innovative one for China, since it's China's first agreement with such a section, while those sections are common in EU's FTAs. Therefore, I have compared the environmental rules of CAI with sustainable development chapters of the EU FTAs. It shows that those rules of CAI are mostly in accordance with EU's FTA model. Some of China's FTAs have incorporated environmental chapters already. The China-Switzerland FTA concluded in 2013 is the first one having an environment chapter for China. It has 8 articles, provides commitment regarding the implementation of multilateral environmental agreements, and includes a soft non-derogation clause where the parties recognize that it's inappropriate to encourage trade or investment by weakening environment protection. The environment chapter of China-Korea FTA, concluded in 2015, contains binding commitments similar to CAI, such as effective implementation of the MEAs, non-derogation and non-enforcement clauses. 2 years later, China and Georgia conclude a FTA, while the parties reaffirm their sovereign right to establish its own levels and priorities of environmental protection. The agreement provides a non-derogation clause and commitments to effective implementation of MEAs. Why the non-derogation clause in those 3 FTAs use the term encouragement, the non-enforcement clause in China-Korea FTA uses the phrase in a manner affecting. So does it mean that from the point of view of Chinese negotiators, there is no substantial distinction between these two phrases? Taking into account Chinese FTAs, provisions on environment issues in CAI are not so strange for China's treaty practice. Nevertheless, those rules in CAI are undoubtedly most concrete and binding. Explicit reference to nationally determined contribution and the good faith decision regarding the allocation of resources are highlights of those rules in CAI. So it remains to be seen whether China's future FTAs will incorporate more concrete and binding clauses on environmental issues under the influence of CAI, or the CAI would be an exceptional case simply because of the compromise with the EU. It's an open question. So thanks for the attention. I give the floor back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Professor Xiaojun. We will have questions, answers later. So now let me go to invite Ivana and Nicholas for your presentation, please.
Thank you very much.
Questions.
Thank you very much. I will just share my screen now. So hello everyone once again. In this presentation, we would like to look in more details at the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism. So we mentioned earlier on in the first session that this is one element of the new EU policy that will have an impact externally. So what is this mechanism really about? So there were a number of questions that have been posed about CBAM, so Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. We'll just use this short and acronym CBAM. So whether it is a competitiveness measure, so is it something that the EU is doing in order to increase its competitiveness with other trade partners? Is it an environmental measure? So does it achieve or aims to achieve climate goals? Is it a protectionist measure? So to what extent it complies with the current international trade rules? And we don't have much time today to discuss that, but we'll make some conclusions about it. And basically, we sum these three questions into the core question for this session, which kind of answers these three questions. And that is, how does CBAM complement the EU's emission trading scheme? So the core idea of CBAM is that it's an external dimension of something that already exists internally. And Nicholas has mentioned it before. So we would like to outline how the emission trading scheme works. Then we would like to talk about carbon leakage, which has been mentioned in the question and answer session, but explaining that link between the ETS and CBAM, and then looking more into more details into CBAM. So if we talk about ETS, what is ETS? If you open the website of the European Commission, it will tell you that is the cornerstone of the EU policy to fight climate change. And first, it is the first such system for trading emission allowances in the world. But I understand that there is a similar system that has been developed at the regional level in China as well. And Nicholas will tell us more about the objectives of the ETS.
Yes, so in a nutshell, the ETS is a directive, so an EU legislation that has been adopted by the EU lawmaker within the frame of its environmental competence. Nevertheless, this directive is setting up a carbon market that is underpinned by a supply and demand of allowances within a cap that is determined
Sorry.
by the... Yes.
Sorry to disturb you, Professor. Could you be a little bit loud?
Yes, of course. So the EU lawmaker has been adopting a directive in 2003 that entered into force in 2005, and that aims at establishing a carbon market scheme that encompasses nowadays 12,000 installations as well as aviations, as it was previously said. So although the directive is based upon the environmental legal base, so it's taking place within the environmental competence conferred by the member state to the EU institution. Nevertheless, the directive established a carbon market that's based upon supply and demand of allowances. This is not a genuine market on the account that it's taking place within a cap that is determined by the EU lawmaker, and the trading of in allowances is regulated to a great extent, and that I shall comment upon in the next slide, please. So the idea is that the carbon market is determined by fair economic objectives that nevertheless enhance the ability to reduce significantly at industrial level the emissions of greenhouse gases.
So how does the scheme work? As Nicolas said, there are allowances that are determined at the EU level. So basically, the allowances serve as the unit of compliance under the ETS. So each allowance entitles the energy intensive industries which are covered by this scheme. Mainly these are power generators or steel companies or cement companies and so on. So it entitles those operators to emit 1 ton of CO2. So European Union distributes these allowances to the member state authorities. Member state authorities issue permits to fixed installations in the member states, in their member states. Permit authorizes the emission of greenhouse gases, and there is an obligation that these fixed installations that have received permit have, and this is the obligation to surround the allowances. And at the end of each year, they have to surround the allowances that amount to a total emissions during that calendar year. So basically, allowances give permission to these fixed installations to emit CO2, and as mentioned, they're valid for a year, and at the end they have to be, the equal number has to be surrendered to the national authorities. Now, what happens if the fixed installations have emitted more than allowances that they've been given? Nicolas?
Yes. So the idea is that the cap is diminishing year by year according to a threshold. It means that there will be fewer and fewer allowances placed in the market. So all in all, companies do compete in purchasing the amount of allowances that do cover the actual yearly emissions. So in case the numbers of allowance purchased on the market by the company does not match the actual emissions, the company will be obligated to purchase extra allowances from other companies in order to cover its emissions. In contrast, whenever the company has been diminishing its production and release fewer amount of CO2, it will have a surplus of allowance that can be traded in the markets. So there is a content supply and demand However, in contrast to a normal market, there is a cap that determines the trade. And the shrinking of the cap leads to an increase of the price of the allowances. Besides, the aim of the lawmaker is to enhance auctioning of allowances. So the companies do take part in auctions on a yearly basis to purchase the needed allowances. However, given that a number of companies, such as cement companies, steel mills, are facing a significant competition from foreign undertakings, the EU lawmaker has been authorizing the executive, the European Commission, to grant allowances for free. So nearly half of the installations that are subject to the scheme are getting for free these allowances. And that has negative effects upon the performance in implementing new technologies with a view to abating the emissions of greenhouse gases. Next slide, please. So as Ivana stressed, on the one hand, the undertakings, 12,000 plants, are required to obtain from the national authorities a license or permit for 10 and 20 years that authorize them to emit greenhouse gases. They have to purchase through auctioning the amount of allowances that match the actual emissions, and this purchase is taking place within this cap. So the trade is determined by the cap set out by the EU institutions. So the auctioning is the principle. The free allocation has to be seen as a derogation. And so what we are dealing with, thanks to the CBAM scheme, is to phase in the auctioning to all the sectors that are subject to international competition, and the phasing out of the carbon leakage scheme of this derogation. Next slide, please. So we are moving between a phase-in and a phase-out. Phase-in of the expansion of the ETS and the phasing in of the CBAM that's replacing the allocation for free. Of course, the EU lawmaker justified this phasing phase-out scheme on the account that the free allocation of allowances has been distorting the pricing mechanism. So the price signal of the allowances that should incentivize the companies to purchase, to implement new technologies, has been rendered nugatory in several industrial sectors on the account that the allowances were conferred for free. And so the idea of the EU institution is to increase the competition between undertakings within this market in allowances. And that's the main rationale for the introduction of the carbon, the CBAM scheme. Next slide, please.
So because the EU is phasing out free allocations, there is now need to, and that exposes also the EU industries and the EU to carbon leakage, there is, or to the risk of carbon leakage, there is now need to complement that with a similar scheme that will impact specified goods upon their import into the EU. So basically, the objective of CBAM is to complement the ETS and to apply an equivalent set of rules to imports to the EU. So basically, that will progressively become an alternative to these free allocations under the ETS, which will be phased out by 2035. Of course, the other objective is also to encourage third states to implement similar green policies, so that the EU sets the standards in a standard in this regard in terms of carbon market mechanisms, and of course to encourage also third country producers to use cleaner technology, so to kind of extend this Brussels effect. So how does CBAM work? Let's say we have a producer or exporter in a third country, let's say China, and we have an importer somewhere in the European Union. And our exporter or producer wants to export products in specific sectors. These sectors are listed in Annex 1 of the CBAM regulation. So these are electricity, cement, aluminium, fertilizers, iron and steel products. So our our exporter wants to export those products into the EU, and our importer has to request from the member state authorities an authorization to import these products from third countries. Then once importer gets this authorization, it will become an authorized declarant. And now our exporter can ship products to the EU. The products will, of course, go through the usual customs procedures. And in addition, these products will have to have a CBAM declaration. So what is the CBAM declaration? Basically, CBAM declaration will specify the quantity of that product which is imported during that calendar year. And it will specify what are the total embedded emissions in the production of that product in third country. So, and the calculation of those emissions has to be done in accordance with the method specified in Annex 3 or of the regulation, or default value will be applied, and we will mention that later on what that really is. And what is important, in case that our producer has already paid some carbon costs in its country of origin, so let's say that producer in China has already paid certain costs, carbon costs in the production, those costs will be reduced. In the CBAM declaration.
Yeah, I might add to this. Let's imagine the case of a Chinese company taking part in a local or regional carbon market, and purchasing allowances from Chinese regional authorities. So this cost will be deduced from the CBAM scheme.
Yes. So the total embedded emissions are the ones that the information comes from a producer, but that information has to be verified according to the procedures within the EU, and these verifiers are located in the EU, so they basically verify that the embedded emissions have been correctly calculated. There is another option for our producer. So to avoid these procedures, basically the producer can register with the central register of the European Commission, and that lasts for 5 years. And it can also then report what are these total embedded emissions in the products that the producer exports to the EU, and those can be used in the for these purposes. So, and then there is, so the authorized declarant or our importer within the EU has to get the CBAM certificates or purchase CBAM certificates from member state authorities, and CBAM certificates, their total number must equal the total embedded emissions minus any costs that have been already paid, as Nicolas just explained, and minus any free allocations of that were given to the EU producers, so the producers in the EU under the ETS, as mentioned in the previous in the previous slides. So this CBAM declaration, our declarant importer has a number of duties, so it has to purchase the sufficient number of CBAM declarations and has to surrender them back to the authorities by 31st of May each year, and those that are unused can be resold. 1/3 can be resold to the member state authorities. So our importer cannot sell them in the same manner as the producer in the EU would sell allowances on the market, but it has to, it can sold them back to the member state authorities, and that's basically because the price of these certificates is determined on the basis of the auctioning prices.
Yeah, I would like to add to this that the scheme is fairly different from the one of the carbon markets on the account that there is no trading in the CBAM certificates. It's we are facing a much more top-down approach under which the importers is obligated to purchase from the competent national authorities, one of the 27 member states where the import is taking place, the CBAM certificates that covers the embedded emissions. What is more is that we are facing legislations that confers significant powers to national authorities, be it the 27 custom authorities or other competent authorities that will be endowed with the powers to sell the certificate for the period considered. So we discuss now what products at stake, which type of emissions, and for which countries. Secondly, we shall discuss the obligations placed upon the declarant that imports the product from the third country, and what will be the content of the declaration. We will provide some illustration regarding the price of the CBAM certificates, be it on cement, be it on steel. And finally, what are the duties, what are the obligations being placed upon the different national authorities. So the proposal for regulation encompasses but a few sectors: cement, electricity, fertilizers, iron, steel, and aluminium. Why these sectors? For the simple reason that they are major energy consumers, and they do emit among the different types of industries a significant amount of greenhouse gases, in particular CO2. So the products are determined according to a combined nomenclature, and so far the Commission is intent upon covering exclusively the direct emissions. Indirect emissions regarding the type of electricity being used in the industry might be considered at a later stage. The European Commission is taking the view that the system must be implemented step by step, and that at an early stage, when the regulation will enter into force, only direct emissions will be taken into consideration. Of course, one is facing more than CO2. The regulations is covering also the emissions of nitrous oxide and perfluorocarbon. So the one has to look at the annex of the proposal for regulation to determine which gas has to be taken into consideration. So the imports from countries belonging to the European economic areas, be it Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and also from Switzerland, are not are not subject to the purchase of the certificates on the account that these countries are already endowed with a carbon market scheme similar than the ETS. The Commission is intent upon expanding this list, this directory list, to third countries in as much as they are ready to embark upon the same type of carbon market scheme. And that was discussed in our former speech when Ivana stressed that the EU is intent upon inciting third countries in implementing some of its regulatory device. So in order to avoid purchase the certificates, a third country will be likely to implement a carbon market scheme that's quite similar to the one provided under EU law. So the CBAM declaration reflects the emissions that's deemed to be embedded in the goods imported, not on a monthly basis, but in a given calendar year. So the CBAM approach is quite similar to the rationnel temporis, to the ETS approach, because the amount of greenhouse gas emissions has to be calculated on a yearly basis, not regarding the production of the steel, but the import of the steel. In order to avoid fraud, the proposal for regulation provide for a verification scheme. Authorized verifiers will have to look at the manner in which the economic operators calculate the greenhouse gas emissions emitted in the aluminium or in the steel or in the cement being imported within the internal market.
So how are these emissions calculated? That is outlined in Annex 3 of the regulation, but basically the calculation is based on the actual emissions which are embedded in imported goods. So the exporters, producers in third countries are the ones that are monitoring these actual emissions, but responsibility, cost, and verification of that data is really on the importers within the EU, so those operators in the EU. In case that there are no actual emissions available, then default values are going to be taken into account. And these default values are based on the literature. So literature and other official data that exist about production in the specific third country, in that specific sector. And if there are no reliable data, then the method is basically to take into account the average emission intensity of the 10% of the worst performing EU installations for that type of goods, which, you know, in a way could be even lucrative for producers in some countries. So, and then the other important aspect are CBAM certificates. So they are, as mentioned, bought by these declarants, so the authorized importers from member state competent authorities. And importantly, their price is not set through market mechanisms directly, but it's calculated depending on the weekly average auction price of the ETS allowances expressed in euros per ton of CO2 emitted. So basically the auctioning price of the ETS allowances does determine the price of these certificates. And these certificates are then surrendered back, as mentioned, by importers based on the embedded emission intensity of the products that have been imported in that calendar year. There is no possibility to trade with CBAM certificates, and that is really a very important difference with respect to ETS allowances. But as mentioned, 1/3 of these certificates can be repurchased by the member states. So basically, our importers will need to make a careful calculations because if they buy too many certificates, they cannot sell them back. Those that cannot be resold to the member states, those that are unused and cannot be resold, will be annulled by 30th of June of the same year. So, so how does that work? How are these emissions calculated?
Yes, so this is an example of cement. The EU export to some extent cement produced abroad, in particular from Turkey. So the calculation of the embedded emissions in 1 ton of cement relates to the attributable emissions of the installation. Let's imagine that the cement plant in Turkey has been emitting, regarding the export of cement to the EU, 70,000 tons of CO2 a year. So that the calculation relates exclusively to the export of cement to the EU, and that must be divided by the amount of goods produced. It's 100,000 tons cement a year. So a ton of cement embeds somewhat 0.7 tons of CO2. So one has to multiply 50,000 tons export to the EU by 0.7 tons of CO2 per ton of cement being produced. And that must be multiplied by the price of the EU allowances. That's calculated on a weekly basis. And yesterday, the price of the allowances on the EU market was 72.59. So the Turkish companies exporting to the EU 50,000 cement, and the importers of this 50,000 will have to pay the national authorities a sum of 2,540,650 euros as the amount of certificates. Next slide, please. So another example is a traditional steel mill in France emits an average of 1.8 tons of CO2 for each ton of steel. Some plants have been succeeding in diminishing the amount of tons of CO2 being emitted. However, life cycle analysis show that an average Chinese steel mill emits an average of 4 tons CO2 for each ton of steel. So it means that the Chinese producer exporting to the EU or the importers of this Chinese steel will have to purchase 4 times as much CBAM certificate than the amount of ETS allowance the French mill has to purchase to cover its in situ emissions. So that means that CBAM is actually fostering a fairer competition between the French steel mill plants that emits less CO2 and the Chinese plant that emits 4 times more CO2 per tons of steel being produced. Next slide, please. So all in all, on the one hand, we are dealing with a cap and trade scheme that is regulated to a great extent. That's reckoning upon, on the one hand, permits or license granted to the plants emitting the greenhouse gases, 12,000 plants, and the operators of these plants are obligated to purchase allowance whenever these allowance are not granting for free. So everything reckons upon trading in allowances within a specific cap. On the other hand, the proposal for the regulations provides no quantitative limits on import on steel steel or aluminium, the products imported are far less significant than the products falling produced by the plants falling within the ETS schemes. We are dealing only so far with electricity, cement, aluminium, steel, and fertilizers. This list is likely to be expanded, and the system is being reckoning upon a declaration that will determine the amount of certificates the importers will have to purchase. And the two systems are interconnected on the account that the price of the certificates has to reflect the price of the allowances. So the EU lawmaker will try to interconnect the two systems, and that's reflects this approach phasing in the CBAM in as much as the carbon leakage scheme is being phased out. So we shall conclude quickly to give
yes, being conscious of time. So what is important to mention now is that this is still at the stage of the Commission proposal. So there is legislative procedure to be completed, and there's still possible changes to this proposal. Once adopted, there is a transitional period of 3 years in which basically the EU is planning to collect data and see how the things are going to work. So the full application where this gradual phasing out of ETS free allocations would start is from 2026. So still a bit some time away. But what is important to mention is, as Nicholas just said, this is the beginning. So it is likely that the Commission will expand to other sectors, and then the issue is also that it might broaden the scope of emissions as well, and in the future maybe include indirect emissions. So things to bear in mind is that why CBAM? Well, we come back to the first session of and the first presentation in the first session. So very ambitious climate target goals. In order to reach those targets, the EU has to phase out the ETS free allocations, and in order to avoid then carbon leakage as a consequence of that, it needs CBAM as the complementary mechanism. So CBAM is complementary to ETS, and phasing out goes hand in hand with phasing in, as Nicholas has mentioned. So CBAM being ETS's alternative. Pricing, again, here we have to bear in mind that EU cap is shrinking every year. So the price of ETS allowances will continue to increase. We've seen the increase from the first presentation that we did on this topic. The price has already increased 13 euros. So that was 2 months ago. So the price of CBAM certificate will follow that increase. And if we look at it, and we didn't have time to discuss that in the context of this presentation, but we believe that as much as CBAM's embedded emission pricing equals the charges which are paid by the EU operators to produce similar products in their installations in the EU, we don't think that there is going to be de jure nor de facto discrimination, and therefore there wouldn't be a breach of international trade law. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much to our two speakers. Well, I have learned a lot. I think the system CBAM is quite complicated, but you have given us a very clear explanation. For the time being, I'm afraid we could not go further, but I see your question on the program is about the CBAM as an obstacle to Chinese importers. I think should have a question mark. And I fully understand from your story about the rationale of introducing this system, which really can, in the long term, benefit all producers. It doesn't matter where they are. Now, let me quickly go to the next speaker, Professor Ellen Foss from Maastricht University. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Okay. Okay, thank you so much for the invitation and making me speak about food. That is a topic that I very much like, and especially, of course, about the food laws. Now, what I will do in my presentation, I will briefly talk about or connect, in fact, to the Green Deal. Of course, I will not talk about the Green Deal as such. I then will talk a bit about the general requirements of the EU General Food Law, and then come to the, and in fact connect to the old farm to fork approach. I will explain it in a moment. I will say something about the farm to fork strategy and the planned actions. And maybe I already have to temper a bit expectations of my presentations, in the sense that there is not a lot out there already from the European Commission. I contacted the European Commission still to ask, in fact, whether they could already share some initiatives or plans that they would have more specifically than is now available, but unfortunately that was not the case. So we will discuss this only quite superficial and briefly, and I will come back then to the impact of the Green Deal and the initiatives that the European Commission plans on the import of food, and try to connect to China. So yes, the Green Deal has been discussed by the other colleagues and the speakers before me, so I'm not going to discuss that. What I would like to highlight, what Ivana already said earlier, in fact, that one important point of the Green Deal is also to improve well-being and health of the citizens and the future generations. And this is then how we connect to food issues. And one important item that the European Commission has identified is, in fact, in this also nice pictograms, is the healthy and affordable food. And in the annex of the farm to fork strategy, you find, in fact, the ideas of the European Commission. It is about the greening of the common agricultural policy, and they have called it again, in fact, farm to fork. And I say again because we already know this kind of strategy, but from a different area, in fact, also from a different era, I must say, and a different time zone, and I will explain it in a moment. The annex to the Green Deal says also that there will be an examination of the draft national strategic plans, and there will be measures, including all kinds of measures, including legislative measures, that will significantly reduce the use and the risk of chemical pesticides, as well as fertilizers and antibiotics. So that is the link, in fact, to food issues and the Green Deal. Now, before going into talking about the ambitions of the European Commission in a new farm to fork strategy, I would like to tell you a bit about the other farm to fork approach that was developed, in fact, in response to the BSE crisis, the mad cow disease that we had here in the European Union, and actually the rest of the world, but in the European Union. That was in 1996, in fact, the outbreak, the discovery that the link between BSE and a new variant of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease could not be linked out, could not be ruled out. So this, in fact, led to a whole crisis in the European Union. It appeared that there was had too much a fragmented approach to food and food law. So what, in fact, in the beginning of 2000 was done is to formulate an integrated approach to the food chain and to develop general principles of food law. So this approach was also in those days called farm to fork. It's a nice alliteration, of course, and I very much like that, but it was also called from the plow to the plate and from the stable to the table. This approach was very much focused on what Ivana already said about more the quality and foremost about the safety of food issues in the European Union. So this, that I will call, so the old had a 2002 farm to fork approach was very much dealing with an integrated approach to food issues and also making sure that safe food would be circulating on the EU market. So in fact, this in fact was all laid down in what we call in the EU the General Food Law, Regulation 178/2002. So as an important element is that the foods shall not be placed on the market if they're unsafe. So this whole concept of foods should be safe when they're placed on the EU market is central in this whole regulation in General Food Law. Also very important, and that of course had to do with all the issues that happened with this British beef. I'm happy to talk about it in more, but I will not explain that, what happened there. But in fact, that we know, in fact, that we can trace back the piece of food that we have on our plate back to the farm, the stable where it was produced, where it was in fact cultivated and produced. So traceability is a very important element of the whole General Food Law. It sees to the ability to trace and follow food and feed ingredients throughout all the stages of production, processing, and the whole distribution. Another important element of the General Food Law was that it introduces the risk analysis concept, which is in fact the concept of that risk. We have risk assessment, so the scientific elements of food decided by scientists, in our case of the European Union by the European Food Safety Authority, the risk management, so the political and the policy elements of that, of a specific food will be decided on by the European Commission, and risk communication. Now, in view of all the things that happened during the BSE crisis, there was a mix and mingle of political and scientific elements, and there was not a clear distinction. The General Food Law decides that there should be quite a clear separation between risk assessment and risk management. And to this end, in fact, also, and I anticipate already a bit, but there's a European Food Safety Authority created in that year. The General Food Law lays also down important principles of transparency, excellence, and independence of the science that is produced as an advice for the European Commission. The General Food Law also gives a codification of the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle, as most of you will know, gives the public authorities, in this case also the European Commission, the competence, the power to act in situations of scientific uncertainty. And as I said already, the General Food Law includes the creation of the European Food Safety Authority. So this European Food Safety Authority is in place since 2002, more or less, and it is a visible, advisory, and independent authority. So what we call in the literature, especially in the political science literature, this agency is at an arm's length distance of the European Commission. So responsibility for the science making and the regulatory science making is taken out of the European Commission and put into this agency. And this agency also operates as a scientific watchdog. So the agency also has to look for scientific divergencies that would exist at the national level with national agencies or with other European bodies. And so this agency the EFSA is giving scientific opinions to the European Commission, on the basis of which then the European Commission will decide. So this kind of agencies that we have in the European Union are not competent to adopt decisions, legally binding decisions. That is in our system being conferred upon the European Commission. The agency is very much of a network agency. It is located in Parma, but it has really strong connections with the other member states and the national authorities in the member states. It is also funded by the EU budget. So in fact, when companies ask for an authorization, for example, of a GM product, a food product, they will not, in fact, pay for any fee, but this is all funded, in fact, by the EU. So the opinion that EFSA would deliver does not, in fact, cost producers anything, and also not the decision that the European Commission will subsequently deliver. So this now I found as an important setting for you to know when we talk about the new farm to fork strategy. In fact, and I think that's also why they have indicated, if you see a lot, in fact, the F to F, in fact, so that's also maybe to indicate, if you see that, then it's really connected to the Green Deal. So it's a farm to fork strategy that is of 2020. So as already was said, in fact, by one of the colleagues, in fact, this farm to fork strategy aims to have a fair and healthy and environmental friendly food system. So it's not so much focused on safety, that already we have in place since the former farm to fork strategy. But now, in fact, we have this additional step to be made to make it environmental friendly, but not only. So it's still healthy, but also interesting. It's also about fair, in fact, fair food. So, yeah, so I can tell you what the objectives are. So the objectives are, in fact, about the environment, to have a neutral and positive environmental impact, to help to mitigate climate change and to adapt its impacts, to reverse the loss of biodiversity, and to ensure food security, nutrition, and public health. And very important also to make sure that everyone has access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious and sustainable food. But so important also that this point of fair, in fact, also that there is a food security element here involved. It aims also to preserve the affordability of food whilst generating fair economic returns, and also being important an aspect of fostering competitiveness of the EU supply sector and promoting fair trade. Important also, it has a global ambition and it supports the global transition to sustainable food systems. So it's not only about the EU, but it's broader than that. It has the global ambition as well. Now, when looking then at the specific, one moment, it doesn't, let me see. Yeah, as specific actions. And unfortunately, here I have then to, we have to content ourselves with only listing of these kind of actions. As I said, there's not a lot known about the specific proposals that the Commission is drafting. I know that the Commission is, for example, also drafting front of pack nutrition labeling proposal, and that sees, for example, to the nutrients to, for example, I don't know if you are aware of that, the Nutri-Score that is now very fashionable in some countries, but also disliked very much in other countries because it would favor, it works with a kind of green and red light, traffic light system almost, saying that, well, for example, Coca-Cola would be zero would be green, but olive oil would be red, in fact, because it's too much fat. And of course, this is very much criticized, especially by countries like Italy, who say this is in fact a wrong system and a wrong signal to the consumers to be given. Well, I know that the Commission is working on this kind of proposals and even thinking of a mandatory front of pack labeling. I do not know how, unfortunately, however, anything more than that. So that's, we have to wait and see. So there was a promise that there would already be something out on the in August or in this autumn of 2021, and we are still waiting, in fact, for some news on that. The Commission, however, has said, specifically also in addition to the labeling aspects, also that there will be the rewarding of the removal of CO2 emissions, the 50% reduction in the use of chemical pesticides by 2030. There will be a 20% reduction in the use of fertilizers by 2030. And there will be a 50% reduction of EU sales of antimicrobials in the farming and aquaculture by 2030. There will also be clarification of competition rules to prevent unfair trading practice. So I must say this is then it's as far as how practical we can become, because more than that is not known. And I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I also am a bit disappointed because I had hoped that the European Commission would have been a bit more fast, let's say, in preparing its proposals. So I can also tell you that the European Commission also considers a code of conduct to develop a code of conduct for responsible business and marketing practice. Also, it will say something about the animal welfare, and especially also it wants to strengthen powers of control and inspection to combat food fraud. So yes, and as I said also, yeah, the food packaging to support environmental friendly materials. I think that is something, of course, that food can really contribute to the whole environmental goal of the Green Deal, is in terms of packaging also, and the whole production of food. Okay, so far then for the actions that are envisaged but need to be further elaborated. Let me then go to the import aspect. So we have in the General Food Law Article 11, which says, and I have put it on the slide, but it's important to know that all the feed and food that are imported into the EU need to comply with EU legislation. However, there's also a possibility that, in fact, there is a recognition by the community that the requirements of the specific laws are at least equivalent to the rules of the EU law, or in fact, whether there is a specific agreement. I tried to look whether there were specific agreements on this particular issue with China. I did not find that, but I'm happy to maybe learn from you, since you're here. Maybe you can tell me and you can inform me. With the knowledge I have, I don't know if there's any specific agreement that would exist between the EU and China. So on this general issues of food laws and the requirements of food laws, and whether they would be equivalent to the EU provisions. The Farm to Fork has this strong ambition, as I already said, to really be the global transition to a sustainable food system. I already heard Ivana talking about the food issues, the food law being the standard, in fact, in the whole world, in the global setting. At least the EU has that ambition. And I know that the European Commission, together with the European Food Safety Authority, do really much their best, in fact, to get a lot of EU standards, especially also in the Codex Alimentarius committees, to make that as the world standard, in fact. There are various also international cooperation, trade and policy, but in fact, the EU will do also is to try to introduce sustainability chapters in all EU bilateral trade agreements, and to provide, in fact, for certain commitments in these agreements on animal welfare, pesticides, antimicrobials. That is, in fact, antimicrobials is not a new issue, but I think it is good that the European Commission connects now also to this important problem that exists in the whole world.
Thank you very much, Professor Ellen.
Yeah.
Sorry, I have to disturb you, to stop you, because we are really
yeah, okay. This way, one last slide, and you can read that maybe yourself. And this is something that I would like to conclude with. So I think the new rules, whatever they might be, this is they will be important for the trade between the EU and China. And I'm happy to hear that Nicolas told that there will be maybe further meetings in this framework, and we would maybe could dedicate some of the meetings to developments that happen in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Allen. You certainly gave us some food for thought. This is a topic I hope more Chinese scholars and law students will follow your path of doing more research work also in China. Now I give the opportunity to Professor Nicolas as the last speaker. I'm sorry that I did not manage to have everyone speak within the time limit. And it's up to Professor Nicolas to decide your time of presentation, because you will also chair the final the panel for Q&A. So I leave it completely to you how you want to divide the time. Thank you.
Yes, I will be rather concise. So, as I mentioned to you, the Green Deal is not limited to renewable energy, to the energy shift. It's much more than this. It's about enhancing ecosystem resilience. It's also about diminishing the environmental and climate impact of products. And the EU has been developing legislation since the early 1970s regarding waste. These legislations complement the EU legislative approach regarding the control of products. And so since somewhat 10 years, the EU lawmaker has been emphasizing the need to improve the economy in making it circular. In other words, waste is trash, waste is money, and waste is not only trash. And so a new circular economy package is being envisioned by the EU institutions. So first question, what is the circular economy? So according to the 7 Environmental Action Plan, we live within the planet's ecological limits. We are actually exceeding year by year this limit, and the circular economy is about not wasting products and to manage natural resource sustainably. So as everyone is aware, products break too quickly. They cannot be easily reused, repaired, or recycled. Many products have a single usage. And so the idea is to break this take, make, consume, and dispose pattern, because the waste is valuable. We are facing a scarcity of resource, and Europe is too much dependent upon the supply of raw materials produced on other continents. In particular, we have seen lately that the price of a natural resource is on the increase, in particular fuel resources. And so the idea is really to make to modify these take, make, consume, and dispose schemes into a circular scheme where the value of products, materials, and resources in Europe is maintained within the European economy, a scheme under which waste generation is minimized. And so that can be fleshed out through a number of measures, such as durability of the product, so improving the life of the products, reducing the weight and the quantity of materials such as packaging, substituting hazardous chemicals by less impacting chemicals, recycling, and improving the eco-design to incentivize the consumer to purchase products that do not have too much environmental impact. So the EU is aware that too much waste is produced. So it's about 1.6 billion tons of waste so far not being reused or recycled. Too little waste is being recycled so far. So only 40% of household waste produced is being recycled, and the amount varies significantly from one country to another country. Last year, somewhat 30 million tons of waste, electric and electronic waste, were exported to non-OECD countries, which epitomized the failure of the EU to enhance self-sufficiency. So what's the objective of the reform is to improve the recycling level of electronics and ICT within Europe, is to improve the life of batteries and vehicles, is to diminish the amount of packaging being consumed by consumers, is to diminish the use of plastic and to replace plastic packaging by other packaging, is to improve the time of textiles and construction and building materials. So the EU reform should encompass a wide variety of materials. Regarding municipal waste, the EU aims at achieving a 65% threshold of recycling of that category of waste. And regarding packaging, the EU aims at achieving 75% of recycling of packaging, which has quite significant and extremely ambitious thresholds. So how to conclude? I would like to emphasize that according to the European Commission, applying circular economy principles should result in an increase of the EU GDP by 0.5% and should create about 700,000 new jobs. So again, we can clearly understand that economic objectives go hand in hand with the environmental principles underpinning the reform. However, one can be critical as an academic because the EU is placing too much emphasis upon a downstream approach, upon waste, whilst to resolve the problem, we need to focus on an upstream approach. So the problem is much more related to the product, to the type of product we are placing on the market that we are consuming, rather than the waste we do producing, in discarding, in disposing of our products. And again, economics come to play here. There is a key uncertainty about whether a secondary raw materials market is likely to be integrated in the production process in Europe. Secondary raw materials are too expensive so far and are not competitive enough. So what matters is to improve the tax schemes in order to make secondary raw materials much more attractive on the market. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Professor Nicholas. I think, yeah, this is all of you have touched a so important and interesting issue, but we really run out of the time. So now I pass my chair to Professor Nicholas to monitor the Q&A session.
Yes, there is a question, and perhaps Mr. Kyojun and Ivana could answer to that question. The EU has been negotiating and signing this CAI, so this investment treaty on investment. Of course, this treaty, as it was mentioned, has been negotiated before the new von der Leyen's Commission decided to embark upon this Green Deal. So we understood that so far the Green Deal is mostly about strategies, but these strategies are being fleshed out into a wide number of regulatory proposals that are likely to become in the near future legislation. So the question is whether the EU at this stage of the treaty process can renegotiate it with a view to fleshing out the circular economy principles and the neutral climate 2050 objective. Is that possible? Would you like to answer this firstly, and then maybe Ivana could complement our colleague's answer?
Okay, I can give some answers. I think the Green Deal is not a totally new thing for EU's policies, then because the EU has always insisted to incorporate environmental issues in its FTAs and bids with the other countries. Therefore, the CAI is a result of those ambitious efforts by the EU. Although, as I have mentioned, China is not so strange to this trend. Therefore, I think for an international agreement, there is not so usual that it includes some concrete issues, including environmental issues, but instead it will provide some general obligations to the contracting parties, those non-derogation and non-enforcement laws. It has no, it does not want to harmonize the domestic laws and regulations in both contracting parties. Therefore, for this reason, I think it's not necessary to renegotiate the terms and clauses in CAI. The important thing is how to implement those obligations in practice. Thank you.
Thank you. Ivana?
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And maybe I can just add that my understanding of the EU trade policy is that climate neutrality as a goal is something that the EU wants to implement in trade agreements with G20 countries. So that's something that the EU wants to put into the agreement with Australia, for example, free trade agreement with Australia. So that's the approach in the new trade policy. But personally, I am rather skeptical about trade agreements achieving environmental goals, I must say. So I'll stop there. I just wanted to take this advantage and ask my Chinese colleague what are his thoughts about the prospects of the Multilateral Investment Court and China supporting the EU proposal for the court, briefly.
Sorry, I have forgotten to open the microphone. So there are also controversial opinions in China, but I think most of Chinese scholars are not so active towards the multilateral investment courts, but rather for a multilateral appellate mechanism.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks a lot. There is a question that I could answer quickly. It's about the fear that price of goods and services are likely to increase regarding ETS implementation, regarding CBAM. Of course, that's the logic. So the EU legal order is underpinned by the polluter-based principle that's enshrined in Article 190 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, and that principle requires that the price of goods and services reflect the environmental externalities. So the idea of implementing the polluter-based principle is to increase the price of services and products that are deemed to be polluting in order to afford to confer an advantage, an economic advantage to products that and services that are less polluting. So that's really the logic. Of course, as I mentioned with my colleague Ivana, there is also a sense of social justice. So Europe, like China, is fairly imbalanced. There is much poverty in some parts of Europe, even in my country, in my city. The level of poverty can be quite high among some parts of the population. And so the EU Commission proposed the adoption of a social fund that will reach 74 billions of euros in order to support companies in need, persons in need. I will stop there. There is another question that other speakers could answer, is that according to the participant, how to allocate the responsibility between the product making a country, let's imagine China, and the product consuming country, imagine Belgium or Germany, with respect to the greenhouse gas emissions. How should the ratio be determined? Who could answer that question? Michael? Yes, Michael Four is going to answer.
Well, I don't mind saying a few general things about that, because it is in economics a classic question that has also been discussed in the framework of the polluter pays principle. If you say, for example, in climate change that the polluter should pay, then the question has also been addressed, who is in fact then the polluter? It is easy to say, and that's what we normally do, it is the producer who is the polluter, and it is the producer who takes care of the CO2 emissions. There are others who say, well, that is a very narrow-minded point of view. You could equally say that it is the consumer, because it is the consumer who ultimately gives rise indirectly also to the emissions, because without a consumer, there would not be a production either. And so for that reason, you could enlarge that question not just by looking at which country is responsible, but also is it production or is it consumption? You know, from an economic perspective, we would normally say there has been a theorem developed by a Nobel Prize winner in economics, Ronald Coase, who says as long as parties or as countries could bargain and could negotiate, by the end of the day, the outcome should, or the allocation should not matter, because it would mean that if there is a possibility for the producers, if they have to abate, for example, emissions, and there are extra costs to pass that on to the consumers, then by the end of the day, it will still be the consumer who pays. And so I think that that is a partial answer here as well, that even if you say the producer country is liable, that by the end of the day, the cost will then be passed on to the consumer as well. I hope for the moment, given that we have only 1 minute left, that suffices, Nicola.
Yes, would you like to conclude, Michael?
Very much, Nicola invites me to say a few concluding words. Dear colleagues and friends, I think it's always important to finish a seminar like this on time. I don't know about you, but I have the feeling that I enjoyed myself enormously this morning. I thought it was intellectually refreshing and interesting, yet also very challenging. I thought it was wonderful that we looked contents-wise at so many different aspects of the Green Deal, that we had an overview of the details of the Green Deal, of the CABM, of the ETS, of the relationship between the CABM and the ETS, of the effects on state aid. We were then also talked about the farm to fork story and how that is affected by the Green Deal. And of course, what we were also interested in is what are the effects of all of these spectacular evolutions also on investments. And I think that many of the speakers today stressed that there may be positive evolutions, there can be challenges. You see that some look at this with fear and they say, will it not lead to restrictions on trade? That if there may be impediments that might trade more difficult. There are others who say there is also for Chinese industry lots of opportunities. Of course, one of the issues is, as many of the speakers were also mentioning, we don't know exactly where the details are. And as we often say in English, the devil is in the detail. And so the implementation still has to take place. It has to be implemented. The practical details are not known. Ellen was also mentioning, as far as the farm to fork is concerned, a lot of issues still have to be decided. So in that sense, we stand here at the beginning of a new and important evolution. Therefore, as many speakers were also saying, this is a fascinating and wonderful project. This is the very first of a series of seminars and conferences that we will hold within the framework of this project. We were very excited that so many colleagues participated. I want to thank wholeheartedly all of the participants, also the chair. I also want to thank very much the speakers, but also all of you who took the time from all over the world, mostly China, we saw, to participate in this event during 4 hours time, to ask also your critical questions. I want to thank also the technical support that you see here. It is wonderful for us. It's always a bit of a challenge when we sit here and we have 4 hours just meeting in a virtual world through computers. Will everything go well? And the surprise happened. Yes, it went all well. So we can go back and relax in the sense that there were no major hiccups. It is a wonderful and important topic, as Nicolas and Ivana was saying in one of their last sheets. You know, what is coming ahead of us, if we look at the scientists, could be an ecological disaster. Some people speak dramatically about the end of mankind and so on, dramatic losses. And as Nicolas was saying, well, the law has a task to change this, and then we could turn it into a new dawn. And so we are indeed for important challenges. But as Ivana was also saying, when we go ahead with these challenges and when Europe is indeed leading, it may also lead to geopolitical changes. And of course, we as academics, we try to accompany by researching those changes and maybe identifying what the possible effects might be. As we said, this was a very first step. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining today from wherever you are. I see, and I look at my Chinese colleagues who are still there. Thank you very much for participating. My Maastricht, my Rotterdam colleagues, even from Australia. I thank also all the participants who contributed, all the people who did the translations that we could with simultaneous translation, Chinese, English. We could follow everything. I think it was a very joyful event. Thank you very much for participating and for being here. I told you that on the Metro website, all the PPTs will be provided. The whole session has been recorded. The recording will also be provided. If you still want to enjoy and you want to see it once more, you can go back and look another 4 hours at the wonderful story. I encourage you to do that. But for now, I think that there is a time of a beginning and there is a time to end. And the time to end has now begun. So I think, dear friends, let us now say goodbye, wave at each other, thank all the participants, and enjoy the short rest of the day in China and the afternoon in Europe. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.